Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
There's one personal, you have a couple of personal references in your book. It's mostly a third-person book, but one in particular that I want to mention because my mother, that I'm doing the oral history of, has a night-blooming cereus that just bloomed, and she said it was an occasion for her agreeing to do and you mentioned a night-blooming cereus in the book. How did the night-blooming cereus deserve to get in there? It's a wonderful story.
Well, first of all, I should preface this by saying that I interviewed over 1,200 people for this book. That meant primarily it was a casting exercise. In other words, I was looking for the three people who would ultimately become the protagonists of this book. I went to senior centers and I went to Catholic churches in Los Angeles where everyone was from Louisiana. I went to Baptist churches in Brooklyn where everyone was from South Carolina. So I went through a great deal of trouble in order to narrow it down to these three people. However, during the course of all of this, I realized that I had not actually heard my own family story, and I set out to also make sure that I had talked with my own parents who had been part of this great migration. My mother had come from Rome, Georgia, to Washington, D.C., and I like to tell people that she had come from Rome, and people say, wow, she's from Rome. Wow. And then I say Georgia, and they say, oh. And my father had come from Virginia, from Southern Virginia to Washington, D.C., which is where they met. And had they not been part of the Great Migration, I wouldn't have existed. So I realized that I'd spent a lot of time understanding, and in fact, had spent more time with other people's parents and grandparents than I had spent with my own parents. And I realized I needed to talk with them. My toughest interview by far was my mother, who absolutely did not want to talk. This was a generation of people, and this was a class of people, ultimately all of them. One reason why this is sort of an underappreciated part of American history is because the people themselves did not talk about it. They didn't even tell their own children about it. So every reference to my family in this book, and there are not very many of them, because I felt that the story needed to be about the whole. These three people represent the 6 million, and I didn't want it to be considered something so personal as about me or my family. But I did not know any of the things that are in the book that are about my family before beginning working on the book. And I think that's a stunning thing when you realize that I had been raised by these people and had not known. The story of the night blooming cereus came by accident. My mother let slip the story, and I found it riveting when she told me about it. I happened to have had some Casablanca lilies on the living room coffee table, and she happened to see them, and she said they reminded her of the night blooming cereus that her mother had grown. And so she proceeded to tell the story, and the story was that this is a gangly orphan of a plant that exists primarily for the singular moment, sometime in the middle of the night, on a day that cannot be foretold unless you're watching it very carefully, so it blooms a beautiful lily-like bloom in the middle of the night, and you have to be watching carefully in order to see it. In other words, it blooms when no one's around to see this magnificent moment. And my grandmother happened to be in Rome, Georgia, a wonderful gardener, apparently known in their block for her roses and others. And she would watch this thing and wait. It was apparently not very pleasant to look at any other time. So 365 days of the year, it was horrible to look at until this one moment. And so she would tell people that she would go and she would tell Amanda Poindexter and Miss Lily Bell Nelson and others in the neighborhood. None of these people did I know before my mother told the story. That her night blooming cereus was about to bloom, and that if you want to see it, you should come by at midnight, and we can wait and watch it with sweet tea and homemade vanilla ice cream. And so that's what they did. And my mother remembered that because that was one of the rituals of growing up in the South that she had to forego when she made this great leap of faith, as did the 6 million people who were part of this migration, which is similar to the leap of faith that any group of people, whether they're coming from Europe across the Atlantic or across the Rio Grande or across the Pacific, everyone has to make, all of us are descendant, most of us are descendant from someone who had to make this difficult decision and to leave not just the harshness of their lives that might have propelled them to leave, but also the lovely moments, the recollections. She remembers those steamy summer nights in Rome, Georgia, on Given Street, where they waited and waited, and that would be the one time when her mother would let her sit down on the porch while all these people were waiting. And at the moment that it would open, and it took a while for it to open, it was said that you could see the face of the baby Jesus in the blooms. And when it opened, my grandmother's friends would all compete to say that they could see it. Oh, there it is, right there. And my mother said she never saw it. She never saw it, but she told that story, and I decided to include that in the book as an example of the things they left behind.
A moment of silence for Miriam Carey, her family, friends, victim of racism, white supremacy, who was murdered in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. Moment of silence. Context of White Supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date is Friday, October 4th, 2013, so I have been told. We will be back tomorrow. That would be Saturday, the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Pacific. Tune in, workplace racism, and catching up on news reports from the past 7 days, including victim of racism who was murdered in Washington, D.C. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. PayPal is in the top right corner. Listener supported. Invest if you think the context of white supremacy is constructive. We left with a cliffhanger last week. Ida Mae Gladney in the clutches of racist man about to be sexually sewered, so we will hop right to it. Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's great migration. I think also from last week we heard that Dr. Robert Pershing Foster was good pals with victim of racism, white supremacy, Ray Charles. And he even gives a nod to the good doctor in his song, Hide Nor Hair. If you listen closely, you will hear it pop up right about here.
Well, I called my Dr. Foster, and when the girl answered the phone, I got a funny feeling the way she said Dr. Foster had gone. She said he left with a lady patient about 24.
Who gets name dropped in a Ray Charles song? How about that? At any rate, we will get started. Context of White Supremacy, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. It is astounding that we began this book in July. It is now autumn, and we are still rolling. We will have several more sessions to go before we get to the conclusion. Hopefully, it has been constructive for all. Pay attention to the footnotes as we read. First audio segment, Context of White Supremacy.
"Just show me what you want cleaned," Ida Mae said. Somehow, something in the way she stood or looked straight at him as she said it let the man know she meant business. He didn't press the matter. He left her alone. "He didn't say no more, 'cause he seen I wasn't that type of person," Ida Mae said years later. And perhaps in that moment, Ida Mae discovered one difference between the North and South. She would not likely have gotten out of it in Mississippi. Her refusal would have been seen as impudence, all but assuring an assault, and there would have been nothing done about it. Here, the Northern men seemed to view such a conquest as a hoped-for fringe benefit, rather than a right. That, along with Ida Mae's indignation over the whole thing, appeared to keep her safe. That day, she cleaned the bathroom, the kitchen, the bedroom, and changed the linens as she had gone there to do. The man stayed in his room. She never went back. She missed out on the rest of the week's pay, which she desperately needed. Later, she confronted the regular girl who worked for the couple. "So you don't do nothing but stay in the bed all day, huh?" Ida Mae said. "Don't ask me to go back up there again." The girl paid Ida Mae out of the money she was making off the couple. The whole sordid affair stayed with Ida Mae for years. She couldn't see how the girl could live with herself. "I just don't know," Ida Mae would say years later. "Supposing the wife came back home. I just couldn't see how she did it." With 5 mouths to feed, the family couldn't go much longer unless Ida Mae found a job. In the fall of 1939, something finally opened up at Inland Steel over at 63rd and Melvina, on the city's southwest side. George had a brother working there. At this point, Ida Mae didn't much care what it was as long as it wasn't days' work cleaning toilets and fighting off the madam's husband. It was her first real job in Chicago. They called her a press operator. She was in the canning department, where her job was to work the presser that attached the curved tops that cover cans as they came down the assembly line. She had to fit the tops on, her arms going up and down, over and over and over again. She was excited at first, but then found it to be a nerve-jangling endeavor. The factory was loud, the noise a little like being inside a car engine. The mechanical arms that she operated were sharp and heavy, and were known to slice off people's fingers and hands. She was on the line one day when another worker, a colored woman, got some of her fingers cut off. Ida Mae was a couple of machines down from her. There wasn't much of a commotion as Ida Mae remembered it. "They stopped everybody for a while," she said. "Then they went out with her so fast, and she never did come back." Ida Mae quit soon after that. A line job turned up at Campbell's Soup, where George was working. It wouldn't last long, either, after a woman stole her coat that winter. She got a job at a printing press, and it looked to be a good one. But in time, she would get a job at a hospital, Walther Memorial, on the west side of Chicago, working as a hospital aide. She sterilized instruments, cheered up patients, which was her specialty, and organized the gauzes, bandages, and intravenous lines in central supply. It took her a while to learn how everything worked and how to get the little scissors and scalpels cleaned just so. "I washed tray by tray and put the instruments back in there till I learned it," Ida Mae said. "And I learned all them instruments. Some of them I couldn't call the name, but you better believe I know where they went." Sometimes she would poke her head in during surgery when she dropped off a tray of instruments she had sterilized. She liked to see the babies come into the world, and the doctors let her stay sometimes. She had been through it 4 times herself, and still marveled at the sight and sound of a new life making its entrance. "They always come out hollering," she said, just like her babies had. "You know, that's amazing, ain't it?" she said. With Ida Mae working, the family could move out of the one-room apartment at 21st and State and into a flat big enough for everyone. In the coming years, they would live all over the Black Belt. Now that they were getting situated, people from back home in Mississippi started to make their way north to stay or to visit and see what it was like. Saint, who had helped them move their things from Ed Pearson's plantation and get out of Mississippi, came up with his wife Catherine and their children and stayed for good. Ida Mae's brother-in-law Aubrey, her younger sister Talma's husband, came up for a while to see if he would like it, but he didn't and moved back to Mississippi, where the people tipped their hat to you as they passed and looked up to him because of his family's long years in the South, where he had made peace and found a way to get along with the white people and benefit from it. Joe Lee, whose flogging was the reason George and Ida Mae had left, even came up and lived there for a while. But he was never quite right after all he had been through. He never married and did not make out very well or live too long, and nobody cared to talk about him very much. One time, George's brother Winston, whom everyone called Win, came up from the plantation just for a visit, and wasn't ashamed to look up at the tall buildings reaching for the sky. George took him around the first day, and at the end of it they settled in for the night. Win got ready for bed and then started calling for his brother. "Come help me," Win said. "I can't blow this light out." George found him standing by the bulb. Win had been blowing on the bulb until he was almost out of breath. "Win, you can't blow it out. You gotta turn it off," George told him, reaching for the light switch and shaking his head. It hadn't been that long ago that he, too, had been callow to the New World. "George showed him how to cut it off," Ida Mae said, "and we never had no more trouble with him." They were becoming Chicagoans now. They would talk about Win and that light bulb for years. It was only a matter of time before just about every colored family in the North, unsettled though they might have been, got visitors, as George and Ida Mae did. There was a back and forth of people, anxious, giddy, wanting to come north and see what all the fuss was about. And whenever a colored guest paid a visit while the migration was on, and even decades later, he or she could be assured of finding the same Southern peasant food, the same turnip greens, ham hocks, cornbread in Chicago as in Mississippi. But the visitors were a curiosity to the children of the North. The uncles and cousins from the South often had a slow-talking, sweetly alien, wide openness about them that could both enchant and startle some of the more reserved nieces and nephews who barely knew them, as was the case with a character from Mississippi visiting relatives in Pittsburgh in August Wilson's The Piano Lesson in the following exchange. Boy Willie: "How you doing, sugar?" Maritha: "Fine." Boy Willie: "You was just a little old thing last time I seen you. You remember me, don't you? This your Uncle Boy Willie from down south. That there's Lyman. He my friend. We come up here to sell watermelons. You like watermelons?" Maritha nods. "We got a whole truckload out front. You can have as many as you want." "What you been doing?" Maritha: "Nothing." Boy Willie: "Don't be shy now. Look at you getting all big. How old is you?" Maritha: 11. I'm gonna be 12 soon." Boy Willie: "You like it up here? You like the North?" Maritha: "It's all right." Boy Willie: "That there's Lyman. Did you say hi to Lyman?" Maritha: "Hi." Lyman: "How you doing? You look just like your mama. I remember you when you was wearing diapers." Boy Willie: "You gonna come down south and see me? Uncle Boy Willie gonna get him a farm. Gonna get a great big old farm. Come down there and I'll teach you how to ride a mule. Teach you how to kill a chicken, too." New York, 1950s. George Swanson Starling. George was just back one evening from a 48-hour turnaround from New York to Florida and to New York again, and had gotten his check and cashed it. Rather than head straight home to Inez, he thought he'd stop and get a drink at a bar near Penn Station. He was with another colored railroad attendant, chugging his beer as the bar filled up. He and his co-worker barely noticed that everyone else at the bar happened to be white, as they regaled each other with stories from riding the rails. When it was time to go, they paid their tab and put their glasses down. The bartender had said very little to them the whole time they were there. Now the bartender calmly picked up their glasses, and instead of loading them into a tray to be washed, he took them and smashed them under the counter. The sound of glass breaking on concrete startled George and his co-worker, even though this wasn't the first time this had happened to them, just not at this bar, and it attracted the attention of other patrons. "They do it right in front of us," George said. "That's the way they let us know they didn't want us in there. As fast as you drink out of a glass and set it down, they break it." There were no colored or white signs in New York. That was the unnerving and tricky part of making your way through a place that looked free. You never knew when perfect strangers would remind you that as far as they were concerned, you weren't equal and might never be. It was just the prerogative of whoever happened to be in a position to keep you from getting what the law said you had a right to, because nobody was going to enforce it anyway. And so the glass he drank from went crashing under a counter in Manhattan. It was hitting George in all directions. At sudden and unexpected times like these in New York, in crude and predictable ways when he went back south for his job, and now on the train itself. He was a stickler for rules and regulations and businesslike comportment, even if it was only for lifting and loading bags. He was in uniform and was representing not just the railroad, but himself and colored people, and he took the job of attending to his passengers seriously. His formal bearing did not sit well with some of the Southern conductors he worked for, who considered him acting above his station, which, to his mind, he was. He still saw himself as the college boy, someone who read the newspapers, kept up with world affairs, and knew as much as most anyone he was serving. The white Southerners he worked with didn't like it any more than the Grove foreman did. "They kept me at a hardship," George said. Somehow, without trying, he managed to get on the bad side of a Southern conductor out of Tampa. The conductor liked to tease and joke with the colored attendants, one in particular. The conductor would nudge and kick the colored attendant, and the colored attendant, knowing his place, would jump and laugh, and to George's mind, put on a show for the conductor. "Ha ha, don't do that, Cap!" The colored attendant would josh the conductor in mock protest. George stood stone-faced and made no attempt to hide his disdain. Now the conductor began making extra demands on them all. He liked to make the rail attendants wipe the railcar steps while the train was moving. He got a kick out of that. He wanted the attendants to drop the traps of the bottom step and wipe the steps down so he wouldn't get dirt on him when he got off to direct passengers at the station. Usually it was something the attendants did once the train had stopped. The conductor didn't want that. He liked to see them bending over, dangling along the side and struggling to wipe the bottom step while the train was running 25, 30 miles an hour. George resisted wiping the steps until he thought it was safe. The other car attendant did as the conductor ordered. George stood to the side, his face pinched and frowning, as his co-worker tried to hold on and clean the step, with the train rocking toward the station and the conductor chortling at the sight of it. One day the conductor confronted George. "What's the matter with you, boy? You can't laugh?" "Yes, sir, I have a good sense of humor," George said, "but I don't see anything funny about what y'all are doing." The conductor began singling out George from that day on, blocking him in the aisles, jabbing him as he passed. There was little George could do about it and still keep his job. George had been through worse things in the South and figured it was just one more thing he would have to watch out for. But it got to the point that when George saw him coming down the aisle to check tickets, he had to step between the seats to avoid a confrontation. "He got to the place when he'd get along about where I was," George said, "and he would step out of the aisle in between the seats and step on my foot like that. And then he'll walk back and look at me." George thought to himself, I don't know how I'ma deal with this, 'cause he gonna do this one day, and I'ma try to kill him." "I was praying that I never had to reach that point," he said. One afternoon, they were pulling out of Clearwater on the Silver Star, a sleek, steel-encased all-reserve train that was the pride of the Seaboard Airline Railroad. It went up the west coast of Florida, along the Gulf of Mexico, en route to New York. It had only the finest and highest-class people on it, as George remembered, and he had worked his way up to that route. As the train gained speed as it headed out of the station, George was helping an elderly white lady with her 2 bags. He had gotten one bag into the rack overhead and was heaving the second bag over the edge of the compartment. "And just as I went up with the next bag and set it up in the rack," George said, "something hit me." He had gotten one bag into the rack overhead and was heaving the second bag over the edge of the compartment. "And just as I went up with the next bag and set it up in the rack," George said, "something hit me from behind like a truck. Boom!" The conductor, a sturdy and heavy-set man, had knocked into George as George tried to steady himself on the moving train while holding the bag overhead. George's knees were bad from all the basketball he had played in high school, and standing on the train, rocking as it was, he was off balance and had nothing to hold on to. "He come up from behind me like a football player blocking the line," George said. The conductor shoved George into the seat where the passenger was. George managed to drop the bag onto the rack and not onto the elderly white passenger, but the force of the conductor's weight knocked George over onto the lady, a precarious situation for a colored man in the South. The train rumbled from side to side as George stood and tried to straighten himself. He suspected he knew what had happened, but looked around anyway and saw the conductor in the aisle, grinning. This feud was escalating to a point that was getting dangerous for George. If the passenger were hurt or frightened by a colored man sprawled over her as he was, George would be the one to take the fall for it, and the conductor knew it. If the passenger grew hysterical and accused George of attacking her, there would be nothing George could do, and far worse could happen to him. But it was a fortunate thing for George that the white woman saw that he had been pushed and did not let it rattle her. "Well, what's wrong with him?" she asked George. "Miss, you know what he was trying to do?" She shook her head no. "He was trying to make me drop that bag on your head. He's just that mean, and he just don't like nobody. He did that to try to make me drop that bag on your head." "What is wrong with him?" George started telling his story about how the conductor had been harassing him all this time, and now the conductor had pushed him and didn't even seem to care about the passenger's safety, and she listened because she had seen it for herself. "Well, something needs to be done about that." "Yes, ma'am, but they just don't pay me no attention if I try to do anything about it." He paused. "But you could do something about it." "Well, who do I write?" "You just write it and I'll send it," he said, not wanting to risk her forgetting about it or just not getting around to it. "You write it and give it to me." And so the woman wrote up her complaint and gave the letter to George. He, in turn, attached a letter of his own and sent it to the superintendent in Jacksonville, Florida, who was over that route at that time. George never heard from the superintendent's office about the harassment he had endured. But when they saw her letter, they immediately went into action, he said. The office called the conductor in to question him about the white woman's complaint and suspended him for 60 days. It wasn't long before the conductor found out that it was George who had had a hand in the suspension, and of course that did not sit well with him. George only heard the outcome from other attendants and never got a response himself. Still, it could be said that he had emerged victorious, and that only created more trouble for him. He had expected as much and had prepared for it. When he dropped off the woman's letter, he decided to do it on the way north, so that by the time it got into the superintendent's hands, George would be well out of Florida and out of the conductor's orbit. Back in New York, he went straight to the railroad office to get a route change. "Look, I'm not going back to the West Coast anymore," George told the dispatcher. "I had an incident down there with a conductor. I know it's going to be rough, and I'm not going back down there." George proposed switching with another attendant who had always wanted the coveted, all-reserve train to Tampa, St. Petersburg, but didn't have George's seniority. George was willing to take a less desirable route to avoid any more trouble. "No, you can't do that," the dispatcher told him. "Look, I just told you I had an incident down there. I'm not going back down there, because I know what they're contemplating. I'm not going back." "Well, I don't know what to tell you. You can't change." George decided to call the other attendant himself. "Look, you've been raving you want to run to St. Petersburg. I tell you what, when we come out Saturday, you sit up in my car in the West Coast, and I'll sit up in your car going to Miami. We'll just switch. You can go to St. Pete, and I'll take your run to Miami." The attendant took George's old route, was happy to take it, and when George's stand-in got to Tampa, a group of white men met him at the train. "Yeah, which one of you boys is that nigger boy called Starling? You George Starling?" "No, sir. I ain't no George Starling." "Well, by God, where is he?" "Well, he's not on here." "Well, by God, we gonna find him. He done got Captain Willis put in the street for 60 days, and we gonna teach him a lesson." When the car attendant who traded routes with George got back from that first run to Tampa, he went to George and told him what had happened. "Boy," he said, "I don't know what you did down there, but they mad with you down there. Don't you go back down there." "Why you think I switched with you?" George asked. "You tell them don't worry. I'm not coming back down there no time soon." George didn't go back to Tampa for 5 years. New conductors and managers came in, and it was only then that George felt it safe to go back. Los Angeles, 1961, Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. It was well into the night of March 20th, 1961, when the telephone rang at the Foster house on Victoria, and Robert took the call. A nearly hysterical voice was coming at him, and Robert tried to make out the facts tumbling out from the other end of the line. It was the wife of a man who had somehow stumbled and sliced his left hand on the edge of a glass table, severing an artery. The man was hemorrhaging and losing consciousness. The man would need to be seen right away. Robert would drop everything for any of his patients, and had done so countless times, to the detriment of his own family. But this injury got his attention more than most. It was a disoriented Ray Charles who was facing the loss of the use of his left hand, a disaster for the piano-playing singer, or, with all the bleeding he sustained, the loss of more than that. The circumstances of the fall were unclear and only made the situation more delicate. For several days, Ray had been under pressure to write a playbook of songs for a big tour coming up. He had put in long hours, dictating the music in his head to a collaborator writing the songs down on paper. He had been up most of the previous night, had worked all day and into a second night. He was finding it hard to stay alert, and he was running out of time. He had turned to drugs before, and so now summoned his heroin dealer to help him get through the night, according to his biographer, Michael Lydon. After the dealer's last visit to Ray's house near Baldwin Hills, Ray went thrashing about alone in his den, knocking into walls and furniture, out of his mind. Ray would later say the episode had less to do with drugs than fatigue, although he was candid about his drug use. "I didn't see how the dope was hurting," he said in his 1978 autobiography, Brother Ray. "I don't mean I wasn't sick now and then in those years, 'cause I was. I'd hit a dry period and go through the same convulsions as any other junkie." As for the events leading up to that night, he said, "I'm sure that sometime during that day, like all days, I had my little fix, and maybe it was stronger than usual." That night, as he remembered it, he collapsed from exhaustion, and somehow in my state of unconsciousness, I slammed my hand against a glass tabletop and sliced it to ribbons. His hand went numb. He was so high, exhausted, or just out of it, the injury didn't register with him, and he just lay there, bleeding like a hog. It was around that time that his son Ray Jr. ventured into the den. Little Ray was 6 years old and wanted to say goodnight to his father. The boy opened the door to his father's den and found him with his shirt covered in blood and blood on the walls. Ray's writing partner and his drummer rushed in to help him. They wrapped his hand in beach towels, soaking up 2 quarts worth of blood, and tried to get him walking to keep him from losing consciousness. They chose not to call an ambulance under the circumstances. His wife Della B., then 8 months pregnant, instead called Robert, who told them to meet him at his clinic at once. Ray arrived at Robert's office on West Jefferson Avenue, bleeding so heavily that he went into convulsions. Robert quickly sewed the wound and admitted Ray into the hospital, where Ray required a transfusion of 4 pints of blood. There, Robert examined Ray more closely and discovered that Ray had not only sliced an artery, but severed a tendon as well. Robert would have to perform emergency surgery to reconnect the tendon if Ray was to regain use of his hand. After the surgery, Robert told Ray he was not to use the hand for 6 weeks. "Naturally, I refused," Ray said years later. His big tour was starting the next week, so he told Robert he would just play with one hand. A publicist had already devised an explanation for the public. They would say he had slipped in the bathtub. Robert could not have been pleased with Ray's insistence, but knew him well enough not to be surprised. With Ray determined to go on tour against doctor's orders, Robert insisted on going along with him to attend to the wound should anything happen to it, which naturally it did. Robert put a cast on the hand to protect it, but that only seemed to attract attention and endanger it more. "Everyone I met couldn't resist touching it or shaking it," Ray recalled. "The hand did get infected, but Bob was there to keep me straight." The tour was a dream of Ray's from back when he had gotten his start in those Jim Crow towns in Florida, where he could just see himself leading a big band like Duke Ellington's, with trombones, trumpets, saxophones, guitars, him on piano, of course, and the Raylettes, his doo-wopping backup singers in their form-fitting sequins and stilettos. Robert traveled with them to St. Louis, checking on his most famous patient's most precious instrument, and loving his front-row seat to smoke-filled celebrity. The tour continued on to Detroit, where Ray struck up his orchestra, and somebody decided to bring a blind teenager onto the stage. It was said that the teenager had been signed up by a new outfit called Motown, and could sing and play the harmonica. It was Stevie Wonder, Little Stevie as he was known back then, who, not surprisingly, idolized Ray Charles and got the chance to play a few songs with him that spring night in Detroit. Ray's hard-driving life of drugs and women was beginning to catch up with him. He would end up arrested for drug possession in Boston and would end up fathering a total of 12 children, only 3 of them by his wife Della B., who divorced him in 1977. But it occurred to him as he was writing his biography that he did not want to leave the wrong impression about his physician, a man he described as one of the dearest people I've ever known. He said, "I must say something about Bob, though, before anyone gets the wrong idea. Although he was my personal friend, and although he traveled with me for about 10 days during the time my hand was in the cast, I never let him do anything illegal for me. I liked him too well for that. If you really love a person, you won't get him involved in something which might hurt him." The hand began to heal, and after a week and a half on the road, Robert felt it safe to return to Los Angeles and to his practice. "He sewed up my hand so smoothly that you can barely detect the cuts today," Ray said years later. "He's the man who got me through the crisis with my hand, and for a piano player, that's some serious business." It was time for Robert to leave the tour for another reason. Not only did he have a life and practice back in Los Angeles, he had another patient to attend to. Ray's wife, Della B., was expecting her 3rd child and wanted Robert to deliver her baby. She had had a difficult delivery with her first son before she had heard of Robert Foster, and had now come to rely on him. The baby was born in May of 1961. It was a boy. After all that had happened in the preceding month, and the time spent tending them before that, the couple decided to name the new baby Robert. The North, 1915 to 1975. From the very beginning, scholars would debate the effects of the migration, whether it was a success or a failure, whether the people who left had done better by leaving or would have been better off staying, whether the poorest among them merely imported the disorganized family systems inherited from slavery and carried into sharecropping, or whether the anonymous, overpacked cities merely brought out the worst in the weaker souls. Usually these were macroeconomic, sociological questions as to the effect of the North or South on the people who left or stayed. But back when the migration first began, the venerable Chicago Commission on Race Relations, convened after World War I, chose to ask the migrants themselves about their perceptions of how they were faring in the North. These were a few of their responses. Do you feel greater freedom and independence in Chicago? In what ways? Yes, feel free to do anything I please, not dictated to by white people. Yes, can vote, no lynching, no fear of mobs, can express my opinion and defend myself. Yes, feel more like a man, same as slavery in a way at home. I don't have to give up the sidewalk here for white people. Sure, feel more freedom. Was not counted in the South. Colored people allowed no freedom at all in the South. What were your first impressions of Chicago? When I got here and got on the streetcar and saw colored people sitting by white people all over the car, I just held my breath, for I thought any minute they would start something. Then I saw nobody noticed it, and I just thought this was a real nice place for colored people. Was completely lost. Friend was to meet me, but didn't, and I was afraid to ask anyone where to go. Finally, my friend came. Was afraid to sleep first night, so much noise. Thought the cars would finally stop running so I could rest. Always liked Chicago, even the name, before I came. Didn't like it. Lonesome, until I went out. Liked Chicago from the first visit made 2 years ago. Was not satisfied until I was able to get back. In what respects is life harder or easier here than in the South? Easier, you can make more money and it means more to you. Find it easier to live because I have more to live on. Earn more money. The strain is not so great, wondering from day to day how to make a little money do. Harder because of increased cost of living. What do you like about the North? Freedom and opportunity to acquire something. Freedom allowed in every way. Freedom of speech, right to live and work as others. Higher pay for labor. Freedom. Privileges, treatment of whites, ability to live in peace, not held down. Freedom of speech and action, can live without fear, no Jim Crow. The schools for the children, the better wages, and the privileges for colored people. The people, the freedom and liberty colored people enjoy here that they never before experienced. What difficulties do you think a person from the South meets in coming to Chicago? Getting accustomed to cold weather and flats, rooming and closeness of the houses, growing accustomed to being treated like people, getting used to the ways of the people, not speaking or being friendly, colder weather, hard on people from the South. I know of no difficulties. Are you advising friends to come to Chicago? Yes, people down there don't really believe the things we write back. I didn't believe myself until I got here. No, I am not going to encourage them to come, for they might not make it, then I would be blamed. Wish all the colored folks would come up here where you ain't afraid to breathe. The river keeps running. Why do they come? I asked a Negro minister in Philadelphia. Well, "They're treated more like men up here in the North," he said. "That's the secret of it. There's prejudice here, too, but the color line isn't drawn in their faces at every turn as it is in the South. It all gets back to a question of manhood." Ray Stannard Baker, Following the Color Line. Every train, every bus, they were coming. Manly Thomas, a migrant from Tennessee to Milwaukee. Whitfield, Mississippi, February 7th, 1958. Ida Mae Gladney. It would become legend in Chicago among the migrants and their children, the lengths to which some colored people would go to get out of the South. The Great Migration was now into its 4th decade. People who were children when it began were well into middle age, and back in Mississippi, people were still trying to escape. Ida Mae would hear about these people and pray for them. One of the most desperate souls was a perfectly well man named Arrington High, who had been consigned to the Mississippi State Hospital for the Insane for protesting the Southern order of things. The hospital and its 100 or so outbuildings, originally called the Mississippi Lunatic Asylum, took up some 3,000 isolated acres in the pine woods southeast of Jackson, near Terrapin Skin Creek, in a place called Whitfield, some 170 miles from where Ida Mae was born. From the time it opened in 1935, anyone saying, "They took him to Whitfield," meant nobody ever expected to see the person again. What got Arrington High in trouble was a weekly newsletter he published that argued for integration. He had been editor of a 2-page mimeographed broadside, The Eagle Eye, for some 14 years, and had made a name for himself, protesting the treatment of colored people in central Mississippi. What got him declared insane, however, was exposing the segregationists who were consorting with prostitutes at a colored brothel that catered only to white politicians. It was a death wish of a crusade that actually may have fit the legal definition of insanity for a colored man in Mississippi at the time. High was taken into custody and committed to the insane asylum in October 1957. It was a sentence that would shut him off at age 47 from the rest of the world and his wife and 4 children for the remainder of his life. He was held in confinement deep in the woods, surrounded by guards and hospital personnel, a good 15 miles from the nearest city. It amounted to a total silencing of a revered dissident of the Mississippi order of things, and a slow death in a crazy place, where he would be subjected to whatever indignities his keepers devised. The world of Mississippi and the world of Chicago were intertwined and interdependent, and what happened in one did not easily escape the notice of the other from afar. Word of his capture made it to Chicago. Ida Mae, a faithful reader of the Chicago Defender, even in the days when it was well past its prime, would take note of people like Arrington High back in her home state and wish them safety. A colored physician that Ida Mae and most everyone from Mississippi knew through word of mouth, a man named T.R.M. Howard, also made note of what happened to Arrington High. Dr. Howard had founded the Mississippi Regional Council of Negro Leadership, a local precursor to the civil rights groups that would become household names in the 1960s. He organized protests from his base in the all-black town of Mound Bayou in the Delta, but his activities forced him to escape Mississippi a few years before Arrington High was committed to the asylum. From Chicago, Dr. Howard tried to figure out a way to help his friend. The asylum put patients to work in the dairy and truck farms and the orchards run by the state. Some of the patients had to be up at dawn to work the farms. Arrington High got up at 5 a.m. on February 7th, 1958, a Friday, to milk the cows, which was one of his chores. It was still dark outside, and instead of heading to pasture, he scurried down a deserted path on the hospital grounds and came upon a row of 5 cars that were parked at the side of a quiet stretch of road. A door in the second car opened, and he got inside the only car with a colored driver. That car and the 4 other cars, driven by white men, inched their way to the exit so as not to kick up any more dust or engine noise. There, the white man driving the lead car in the caravan motioned to the hospital guard at the front gate. The guard waved the processional through with a tilt of his flashlight. Arrington High was out of the asylum, but not out of danger. The motorcade took the highway, careful not to drive too fast or too slow as to attract attention. They drove 105 miles through Palahatchie, Hickory, Meridian, and Tumsuba, Mississippi, to the Alabama line. It would take them more than 2 hours to get there, and they had to watch for cars tailing them and sheriffs hunting them, as surely by now the asylum officials knew that High had gone missing. At the Alabama line, the drivers took no chances. They did not cross the state border themselves with their Mississippi license plates. Instead, they took Arrington High to the state line and instructed him to get out of the car and walk over into Alabama. There, a caravan of 5 other cars, all with Alabama license plates, were waiting for him. As before, there were 4 white drivers and 1 colored driver. The caravan would attract less attention if 2 colored men were driving together than it would if Arrington High were riding with a white man. He was in Alabama, but still not safe. He was still in the South and within siren call of any Mississippi sheriff. The cars took him to a predetermined location. There, waiting for him, was a pine coffin. He was told to get inside. The coffin had breathing holes in it for him to get air. The men sealed him in the coffin and loaded it onto a hearse. On top of the coffin, the men placed a load of flowers so that it would appear that the coffin had just been driven from a funeral. The hearse drove to a railroad station where the coffin was loaded on a train bound for Chicago. He lay still and quiet, unable to turn over or adjust himself for the 15-hour ride to the north. The moment the train pulled out of the station in Alabama, bearing Arrington High's coffin, Dr. Howard, awaiting word in Chicago, got a long-distance telephone call. "The Eagle has flown the coop," the voice on the line said. High made his escape in a ritual of last resort that in some way or another had been used to deliver black people out of the South from the time of the Underground Railroad, the slaves using whatever means they had at their disposal. Men disguised themselves as women, women dressed as men to elude detection. A century before High was nailed into his coffin, a man named Henry Brown, a slave on a tobacco plantation near Richmond, Virginia, began plotting his escape the moment he saw his wife and 3 young children carted away in chains to some unknown part of North Carolina. His master had sold them off. Brown did not know they were being sold, did not get to hold them one last time, did not know where they were being taken, and would have been flogged or worse if he tried to search for them in North Carolina. He chose to leave the South and the whips and thumbscrews altogether. He prayed over it, and it came to him that he should pack himself into a box and get himself conveyed as dry goods to a free state. He had a carpenter build a crate of a size commonly sent on the rail cars. The box was 3 feet, 1 inch wide by 2 feet, 6 inches high, and had 3 little gimlet holes for air. Brown then went to a white man he thought he could trust. The man asked if the box was for Brown's clothes. Brown said no. He was going to get into it himself. The 5'6" Brown would have to fold himself into the fetal position and remain that way for the 20-odd hours it would take to reach the north. His white friend did not think it safe and did not want to seal Brown inside the box. "I insisted upon his placing me in it, nailing me up," Brown wrote in his autobiography, and he finally consented. The friend had promised to accompany the box to protect it on the journey, but at the last minute decided against it. Brown would have to go it alone. The friend sent a telegram to an acquaintance in Philadelphia that such a box was on its way to his care. The morning of March 29, 1849, the friend carried the box, with Brown folded inside with a few small biscuits, to the express office. There it was later placed upside down, which left Brown sitting on his head, even though the box explicitly said, "This side up with care." From the express office, the box went to the train depot and tumbled roughly into the baggage car, where it happened to fall right side up, only to be put on a steamboat upside down again, and left that way for close to 2 hours. Brown was in agony, but dared not moan. He waited for death and prayed. Then he heard the men say, "We have been here 2 hours and have traveled 20 miles. Let us sit down and rest ourselves." In so doing, the men happened to turn the box over. The box then arrived at the depot in Washington. There he heard a voice say, "There is no room for this box. It will have to remain behind." Brown, stiff and contorted and now fearful, had to keep silent. He felt a man's hands reach for the box and squeeze it onto the rail car, his head pointing down again, until someone righted it at the next stop. He arrived in Philadelphia at 3 in the morning. He had been doubled up in the box for 26 hours. Before daylight, a wagon drove up and a white man got out and inquired about the box. He carried the box to an office on North 5th Street. Several abolitionists had gathered to witness the opening of the parcel. They locked the door behind them, but once the box was placed before them, the men seemed afraid to open it. Finally, one of them said, "Let us rap upon the box and see if he is alive." Someone then tapped on the sides of it. "Is all right within?" the voice asked, trembling. "All right," Brown replied. The people were joyful, and Brown was free. He would go on to Boston, which was judged to be safer, and for the rest of his life he would go by the name of Henry Box Brown, in light of how he had gained his freedom. Some 100 years after Henry Brown shipped himself north, the train bearing Arrington High's coffin arrived at the 12th Street station in Chicago. Dr. Howard, the friend who had helped organize the escape, met the train at the station that would come to symbolize the Great Migration itself. The coffin would now have to be transported by hearse to a funeral home. There, a group of men opened the lid and welcomed Arrington High to the receiving city of Chicago. The people were joyful. How many people fled the South this way during the Great Migration is impossible to know, due to the very nature of the mission. For the operation to work, it required the highest level of secrecy, coordination, and planning worthy of the Secret Service, the active and willing participation of sympathetic white Southerners, the cooperation of funeral homes in both the departure and receiving states, the complete trust of the person being ferried out by friends and loved ones willing to put themselves in danger to save a single soul, and a good measure of courage and faith on everyone's part. It would appear from the precision of the Arrington High escape that this was not the first time the people involved in its execution had carried out an operation such as this. To this day, many funeral directors refuse to discuss the matter, admit their involvement, or bring unwanted attention to it, in case it would seem it might need to be used again. That underground is as effective today in the South, Arrington High told the Chicago Defender after his arrival, as it was during the days of slavery. It was Dr. Howard who, with the help of more than a dozen others, arranged for his colleague's escape and greeted him upon arrival. He knew what it meant to flee for your life. He did not have to imagine what Arrington High had been through during that dark, cramped ride to Chicago. He himself had to be spirited from Mississippi only a few years before.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. If you are not interested in using your phone to dial in. You can use the flash phone as well. The apps are also linked on the Black Talk Radio page for the cows. But if you have a computer and you want to use the flash phone, it is tiny.cc/one-race. Address again, tiny.cc/one-race. You can click, if you're listening at the Black Talk Radio page, you can click the black button in the center of the page that says call the show. Click it. It'll open up a small window. All you have to do, there'll be a drop down window. You'll see 3 lines in that window that opens up. The first line, select the number, which is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Excuse me, the number will just be there, so it'll be 760-564-943 is the code. You can put that on the second line. Code again, 564943, and then the third line is for handle, name, whatever. You can leave it blank. You can put in pseudonym if you like, nickname, whatever the case. Again, you can't just leave it blank. Click the green button at the bottom of the window and it'll connect you to the program. You should be able to hear live the broadcast. If you want to participate, it's the same procedure. Press *6. You'll hear an audio prompt to press the number 1. Once you do that, it'll put your hand up and I will get you on the line. We will get the folks that have dialed in. I'll get other hands as I see them. Try not to wait until the last minute. We're going to do about, 40 minutes of exchange, and then we'll start the second audio segment. The folks that dialed in thus far, we should have B. Moore and Mr. Demery 4, excuse. Let's see. Looks like we might be having the same issues again. We'll see if we can get B. Moore on the line with us as well. All right. Let's see if this works. We'll add her to the line.
Peace.
All right, should have you on the line.
This service is access code accepted. This conference is being recorded. Q&A session started.
All right, I think we subverted white people's attempts to make a little interference. We should have B. Moore, Mr. Demery 4 with us. We'll do females first since we had to do extra work to get B. Moore on the line with us. B. Moore, if you had any thoughts you wanted to share, feel free.
Yes. Peace, Gus, and all the other listeners. I will apologize firsthand because I missed some of the call because the app is still giving me problems. But, yes. I noted the talk about ball games. I had a Dr. Welsing moment. It's where George Starling was talking about how his knees were bad from all the basketball he played, and then how the conductor knocked into him like a football player. I just noted that, and I also put how people dedicate their, non-white people, how we dedicate our whole lives to ball games just to be injured and aching later. So I took note of that. And then I also took note of how the conductor was suspended for his behavior / mistreatment, but only because a white woman complained. He didn't get let go, but only temporarily suspended, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was with pay. Another thing I noted, I thought it was really cool that Dr. Robert Pershing Foster had a sort of relationship with Ray Charles, and how that relationship began, I guess, about him doing the major surgery on his almost severed hand. But I didn't like I guess talking about his addiction, but I mean, it is what it is. I took note of the black male hiding in a coffin to go north, and I thought it was just like formal slavery. And then also I took note of Henry Brown, who shipped himself north, and took note of the fact that he said he went to a white man who he knew he could trust, and he called him his white friend. And then back to the guy who shipped himself north in a coffin, how the box said this side up or whatever. No, I think I'm mixing them up. Sorry. Henry Brown in the box, he was saying that the box said this side up and handle with care, but he was still being tossed around and put upside down and things like that. And the fact that he was in the box for 26 hours. But yeah, that's all the notes I got because I'm being cut off. But that's all for now.
Right on. We should have Mr. Demery 4 with us as well. There was another person that had a hand up, but then it disappeared off the switchboard. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, I see it again. I'll get you as well. Mr. Demery 4, you should be with us as well.
Yes. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I had some difficulty hearing B more, but maybe it'll be clear in the archives. This particular first greetings to you, Gus, and to the other listeners and callers. It started with Ida Mae, and it seems like it ended with Ida Mae. I'll start mine with George and Ida Mae. It was 2 years in the North. They had 3 little ones to feed. George had been working on a coal truck. He had dug ditches, delivered ice. He had finally got a job at Campbell Soup. That was his first indoors job. And I made note that the author used the phrase, the great clocks of the sky, to make reference to what George and Ida Mae was used to working under instead of a time clock. But I made note that that phrase was coined by Robert Redfield, who was an anthropologist that wrote a lot about non-white people who lived in what he called little tradition, and he wrote it in contrast to taking into account the broader civilization of the so-called great traditions, which in his words would be the white tradition. I think that's important because whites in a system of global racial domination, as a contrast to white privilege, which might give us a key to why white people find this book interesting. But Ida Mae knew that as a black woman, that black women were victimized by white men in the South and that nothing could be done about it by them or their husbands. She had avoided being in situations like that because she didn't work for white people. Rarely did she work for white people. But I think it was interesting that when she was confronted with a terrorist act, the white man was getting ready to rape her, the first thought that she had was of her pious husband and how he wouldn't stand for another man touching his wife. And I think this led me into contemplating how non-white and blacks react to acts of racism. That after a period of time, victims seem to settle for the mistreatment by lying to themselves. This is an act of self-disrespect or a lack of self-respect. So I made notes that may assist some blacks or non-whites in realizing whether or not they have a problem with self-respect. I think that number one, we should think about what it means to respect someone. Number two, practice basic self-respect towards yourself. Number three, recognize when people disrespect you and take steps to stop it. And number four, take care of your body. And number five, last but not least, get to know yourself. Know your standards and your principles, what you can stand for. I think it was interesting that the author mentioned that was a sordid affair that stayed with Ida Mae for years. She couldn't see how the other black woman could have lived with herself. She was wondering what if the wife had came back. But we know that sometimes the wife could have known about her husband's, the white man's, fetish. It was sleazy, seedy, and degrading. Trifling. It's just part of the antics and part of the system of white supremacy. I'll mute my line. I'll come back later with further commentary. Thank you for taking my call.
Mm-hmm. Excellent notes on the importance of self-respect. Talk about that pretty regularly. The person that dialed in from a blocked number, I'm not sure. It's not letting me open your line for some reason. Same issue I was having with B Moore, I think. If you want to hang up, dial in again, we'll see if that works. I'm not sure what the problem is, but if you dialed in from a blocked number and you put your hand up, it's not letting me. Just hang up, dial back in. As soon as I see your hand, we'll try it and see if we can get you on. Yeah, we left. I know we had our cliffhanger from last week and seeing how Ida Mae was going to deal with this racist trying to sexually terrorize her while she's taking her friend's spot working this job for a week. Apparently, I guess her friend, also a victim, I guess, was all right with this or tolerated this, being in bed with this racist white man. And I thought it was noteworthy that she said that this racist man understood that Ida Mae was serious just by the tone of her voice. And he left her alone, she cleaned, and that was that. To me, that again signals the importance of words, and not just what you say, but the way that you say it. I guess with her tone and the way that she carried herself, letting him know that she was serious, she was not going to back down, thinking of her husband, thinking of her family, and having some self-respect in the way that she responded and vocalized that she was not going to put up with this from this white guy. I think that real important. I think that's something that we can apply right now, 2013, in our dealings with white people, just our use of words and particularly the way that we speak to white people to let them know that we're serious with regards to how we're going to be treated and what we're going to tolerate, given our weak state, still using our words to the best of our abilities. I do see the person that dialed in from a block number. We'll try it again. That is interesting. It is still not working. I'm not sure. It's not showing up. I don't know how you're dialing in, if you're on a phone or if you're using the flash phone or an app or what the case is, but the person from a block number is still not working. If you want to try the flash phone, that should work. I don't know if you're trying the app or how you're dialing in if you're on a phone line, because it's just showing up as a blocked number. But it's still not working. You can shoot me an email and we can kind of troubleshoot what could be the problem, but it's not allowing me to unmute your line for some reason. I'm not sure what that is. I'm clicking it several times and it's not working. I'm not sure what that is. Feel free, shoot me an email, untiljustice@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can troubleshoot, figure it out. I think some of the other points that you all raised with regards to the black male who, oh my gosh, Arrington High, the black male who had to ship or be shipped in a coffin to escape Mississippi. I thought that was stunning for so many reasons. I think if I got my notes correct just on the why he had to be shipped, let me make sure I go back and read this. This is one I would love to give out page numbers for, but they won't match up correctly because I have the ebook version. But this is Arrington High. It says, what got Arrington High in trouble was a weekly newsletter he published. Black journalists, once again, if nothing else, that has been phenomenal. The importance of black journalists, knowing the context of white supremacy in some meager way, might be continuing in those footsteps of the importance of black journalists in highlighting and informing about the system of racism, white supremacy, white terrorism. But Mr. Arrington High, what got him in trouble was a weekly newsletter he published that argued for integration. He had been editor of a 2-page mimeographed broadside, The Eagle Eye, for some 14 years and had made a name for himself protesting the treatment of colored people in central Mississippi. What got him declared insane, however, was exposing the segregationists who were consorting with prostitutes at a colored brothel that catered only to white politicians. It was a death wish of a crusade that actually may have fit the legal definition of insanity for a colored man in Mississippi at the time. Astounding bit of information for a person I had never heard of, no surprise, but wow, all the way around, particularly given this week about, or at least the last 2 weeks, they have been talking about these crazy black people in the nation's capital, Aaron Alexis and now Miriam Carey, these crazy black people running around, how easy it is to be labeled insane, crazy if you are a black person, particularly if you're speaking out against racism, white supremacy. But it does not take much to stroke of a pen, few words from a white person, and whammo, you are a crazy nigger, and that's that. And white people can do whatever they want to you. If that means lethal force, if that means you being in an insane asylum, whatever. Oh well, you'll just be stamped a crazy nigger, and that's that. But that is astounding, little tidbit of information. I had a few other notes, but I'll double check. I know the caller that was having difficulties. If you get it figured out, if you want to dial back in, or you can drop me an email and we'll see if we can troubleshoot. They had that section where they were talking, I guess they were doing surveys. I think Mr. Demery had brought this point up on an earlier program where he reinforced that white people study us in detail. We're talking scientific terrorists. And how the Chicago Commission, they went out and did this massive survey, it seems, on the black people who were moving to the Chicago area, why they were coming there, what this was all about. I'd said before, you can download the book, The Negro in Chicago, and it's got like the full survey that they conducted. You can read it out, the questions that they were asking, the responses that they got. It takes up pages in this book. I'm not going to read it all, but just there's a paragraph before they get to that. And it's talking about some of the reasons that some of these victims gave as to why they were leaving the South, why they were coming to Chicago. And they wrote that they had been told, this is the black people, they had been told that no discrimination was practiced against Negroes in Chicago, that they could go where they pleased without the embarrassment or hindrance because of their color. Accordingly, when they first came to Chicago, they went into drugstores and restaurants. They were refused service in numbers of restaurants and at the refreshment counters in some drugstores. The family has begun the reestablishment of its community life, having joined a West Side Baptist church and taking an active interest in local organizations, particularly the Wendell Phillips Social Settlement. The greatest satisfaction of the Joneses comes from the escape from Jim Crow conditions and segregation and the securing of improved conditions of work, although there is no difference in the wages. And it goes on to give, like I said, it gives a rundown of lots of answers, lots of interesting details, but I would just emphasize once again, white people are not ignorant about racism, white supremacy. These white people, looks like just a detailed study, like she's just giving you a skimming of the surface with some of the questions and responses. Isabel Wilkerson in the book, because I mean this takes up pages and pages and pages of some of the responses that they gave with regards to why they left, what the differences were, what they had heard, would they recommend other black people to come to Chicago. Very interesting. You can download this whole thing for free, The Negro in Chicago, and this is on, it takes up like pages 97, 98 through like 105 in the book, just going through this survey that they were conducting, studying their victims. One more quick point I'll get in, and then I'll see if any other folks have comments. With regards to Ray Charles, I think B. Moore, she was saying about hearing about his drug addiction, which it seems he was pretty open about talking about the troubles that he had with drugs. I would just point that out, him slicing his hand up that bad and it impacting this big tour that he was about to have. I would just point that out when people talk about drug use and the escapism, using any sort of drugs, narcotics, even alcohol to deal with the stress of racism, white supremacy. I think Mr. Fuller says pretty consistently, you do not want to attempt in your attempts or in our attempts to solve the problem of racism or any other problems, you don't want to make new problems. And it seems like drugs consistently create more problems. And it seemed like this massive problem for Ray Charles almost could have been a career ender, a life ender, using drugs. Just pointing that out. Drugs might not be the best way to go, legal or otherwise. Any other folks have any other comments they wanted to get in? We should have B. Moore still with us. Mr. Demery 4, I'll keep an eye on the switchboard.
Yes, can I be here?
Yes, sir.
I didn't want to let it pass without mentioning Joe Lee. You mentioned Joe Lee. He had, like so many other victims of racism, he never got over the terroristic act of racism that was perpetrated against him. The book said he was never right after that. He never married, and he didn't make much of his life, I guess, and he didn't live too long after that. And the kicker was nobody cared to talk about him very much. And that's one of the things that we do as non-white black people. We don't talk about these acts of racism, and we don't emphasize the effects that it has upon the victims. They mentioned Winston, there's some relations to George. He came to visit as others trying to start a new life in the North, but he had been retarded by the system of white supremacy. He was attempting to blow out a light bulb. And so instead of discussing how the system has retarded us all, he became the butt end of a joke for many years. They probably laughed about how poor Wilson was trying to blow out that light bulb. George, Swartz, and Starling experienced racism in the North. when he stopped by a bar just to have a drink. Even when we get some degree of acceptance where we can go in and have a drink, the whites couldn't deny him a drink, but they made sure that he knew he was still only a nigger because they broke the glasses that he drank from right in front of his face. George, in a later incident, showed self-respect when he would not laugh at the mistreatment that was being done to him and others by the train conductor. It reminded me of the movie Nothing But a Man, when Ivan Dixon wouldn't laugh at the jokes of the white man, and the others were so conditioned that they would laugh and did not know when they were being mistreated. George used counter-racist jujitsu when he used the incident with the elderly white woman. He was smart when he offered to send the letter. He just wanted her to write it. And then he timed the delivery of the letter so that he would be out of Florida when the stuff hit the fan. Later, which I guess he had to do it, it didn't seem too codified, but he traded his route with an unsuspecting attendant with less seniority than himself. And that brings up a point that we have to be aware as victims of this tactic that is used by other non-whites that may put us in a situation of peril. We have to be ready for that. You mentioned Ray Charles, and Ray Charles was self-medicated with street drugs, lying to himself about whether or not he was hurting himself. He was just fortunate that Dr. Robert Foster was there to attend to him and help attach that tendon, or Ray Charles may never have played the way that he did after that, thinking about a white doctor attending to his hand. Ray Charles' attempted marriage ended in 1977 with Della Bell. And a few notes on the White People's Commission. Like you said, asked the question, do you feel greater freedom and independence in Chicago? And you know, even if black people or non-whites would have gave negative answers, they never would have been published. It's just like when you hand the microphone to a black person and they're on the news. If they give any negative commentary or something that they don't want published or said on TV, that just get edited and taken out. So it's always a spin on it to make us look ignorant and ill-informed. Arrington High represents the thousands of slaves blacks that were committed to insane asylums, never to be heard of again. If it hadn't been for Dr. T.R.M. Howard, he would have suffered a slow death in a crazy place where he would have been subject to the indignations, any indignation that the white people could devise. His escape resembled a military excursion behind enemy lines. It just serves to remind us that we are in a war and we should conduct ourselves like that. I'll mute my line.
The planes are scooting by overhead. I'm sitting outside because it is the weather improved. I saw the sun for the first time in about 2 weeks today. It was a very lovely day. back to autumn weather as opposed to a fast forward to December weather. The person that called in from a block number, I'm having the same issue. Your line is not working for some reason. I'm not sure what the issue is. I'm not sure if you, like I said, I don't know how you're dialing in. It's not showing up. If you're dialing in from a phone, if you want to try the flash phone player, if you're near a computer, see if that works. If you're using the flash phone or what have you, if you have a phone, you can try that out. If you have one of the apps for either the iPhone or the smartphone, you can try that out as well to see if that'll work. I'm not sure how you're dialing, but it's not allowing me to unmute your line for some reason. We've had that issue with a couple folks dialing into the program where that's been a problem. We have about another 12 minutes. So if anybody that's listening in, if you had something you wanted to share relative to the book and you wanted to get it in before we go to the second audio segment, got about another 12 minutes. You should get your hand up now. If you don't get it in, just make a note, and we should have ample time after the second audio segment to share. So if you do not share before we start the second audio clip, just make a little note, and we'll get it on the second section. With regards to George Starling, it seems like this is at least the second time that he narrowly avoided death as a result of standing up to his racist co-workers. Just that in and of itself is something I think that shouldn't be passed over lightly, and why I emphasize that we should be talking about racism, particularly talking about racism on the job. I mean, just the stories and things that we're hearing from these white people. And it seems like all of these characters are having major incidents. It doesn't matter what their field of work is, whether it's Dr. Robert Pershing Foster, Ida Mae Gladney, George Starling. All of them are having major incidents of racism on the job. And I just don't think that has changed very much. That's been one of the main things that I've been pointing out the whole time that we've been reading this book. Let's look for parallels. Let's make sure that we're paying attention to see things that haven't really changed very much over the last 100 years. And that's one that I think is definitely still in place. It might not be that a mob of white terrorists is waiting for you when you punch out on your job, but certainly having difficulties and troubles on your job from white people, that should be extremely painfully familiar for any black person, any non-white person in the known universe under the system of white supremacy. So I hope that's not something that is lost. I hope we are looking at that and maybe saying, hey, maybe we should make sure that we are talking about this with our children, other non-white people that we care about, and not just bottling this in and being frustrated about it. Because it seems like some of these characters did come up with some successful strategies to minimize the abuse that they were facing and to try to deal with it as best they could. I know with George that I don't know. Maybe do you think maybe he told the male that he swapped routes with, that there could be some danger for him, because it seems like the black person that he swapped routes with, it seems like that they didn't get mistreated. It seems like they came back and were more concerned about him and letting George know that they were waiting on him down in Tampa, that they were gonna Voltron on him and likely kill him if he had come back down that way as a result of him getting this white guy suspended for 60 days on the job. Do you think he didn't tell him anything, or do you feel like it was something extra that he should have, or maybe do you feel like it was incorrect for him to swap routes at all, even if he did tell this black person, the reason why he was doing this?
Were you asking me a question, Gus?
Yes, sir.
Okay, no, I didn't think it was incorrect, but I just said, as black people, we have to do what we have to do in order to survive. But then sometimes in doing that, we may endanger other blacks or non-whites unaware. So we must be aware that we're in a dangerous situation and that, you may be put in harm's way, maybe directly, indirectly, consciously or unconsciously. It's just having the knowledge of that and not, to be hung up on why he did it, because George had his reasons for doing it. He couldn't have told him that, man, I'm going to give you a better route because I got to get away from these races, because it was putting him directly in the path of the races. But then again, that guy has to come up with his own ways of dealing with the situation. After he's in it, he chose to take the trade, so now you have to deal with it. No, I don't think it was incorrect.
Definitely dangerous. I would definitely agree. That another illustration of Voltron. White people have a gang ready to roll to defend and support them. You cost me 60 days of pay. I got a group of terrorists waiting to snatch you up off the train and degrade, humiliate, and kill you at a moment's notice. Also thought the treatment of just the things that they were doing to the black workers on the train, George and his co-workers, making them clean the stairs while the train was in motion. And I think he was saying that the white people, they would come up and push on them and kick them like they were joking, and the black people would go along with it in a joking manner. I think there's a lot of that still goes on. 2013, almost 2014, I think there's a lot of that still goes on, where white people are saying all kinds of racist comments and maybe even some physical activity, and we're just supposed to go along like this is, some sort of joke or stage production, that we're just having a little fun, making the time go by on the job. And that is another one. Self-respect, I think, could go a long way in how you carry yourself. I know a lot of us, we are terrorized. Keep saying that. This is a system of terrorism. And I think that, again, huge point that has been made, that fear. I think that even goes to why, I think when Mr. Demery Ford, he pointed out with Ida Mae Gladney and her husband George, they didn't want to talk about what happened to Jolie. And I think it's a lot of fear that goes into that. I'm sure Ida Mae Gladney remembers that white mob coming to her doorstep and threatening to beat her with a chain. I think that's got to be a lot of fear and terrorism, trauma associated with that, and just not talking about it and being fearful, how to deal with white people, how to respond to white people. I think we were even talking about that on the Saturday program last week. White people making racist jokes on the job and the non-white people laughing, going along with it, and how to respond to that, maybe even being afraid not to laugh. I think that's something that we should definitely be working on, to fear less so that we can respond correctly when that sort of thing does happen, so that we're not just falling into the easy response of laughing or going along with it, just carrying ourselves with a little more self-respect, that this is not correct behavior, and you don't have to jump up and down and start quoting Malcolm X. Just, I don't particularly think this is funny. Same, exactly what Mr. George said. I don't particularly think this is funny. And let's just try and get our job done efficiently, constructively, and safely. This right here, I don't think it's funny. And a lot of the stuff that they were doing is not even safe. And I know a lot of that still goes on, where the things that are being done to black people, it's putting them in harm's way. It's not even safe to be doing this sort of stuff on the job. So just emphasizing self-respect again in the way that we carry ourselves with white people at all times. Let's see. Yeah, the black press, that they were talking about the Chicago Defender. I think that was how Ida Mae Gladney, that was how she found out about Arrington High in the first place, the black male who was crusading against white racist politicians, going to these black prostitutes, brothels, and doing whatever God knows what with them. I didn't see a footnote there. If I missed it, I'll check back when we get to the second audio clip to see if I missed where she might have gotten that information from, because I would love to get more details about that. If he was doing journalism, I would think there would be some articles maybe archived someplace where he wrote about this, Other people wrote about this. I would love to get more information about that. I think that's another one that doesn't get talked about. White people and their long, ugly tradition of sewering non-white people worldwide. Would love to get more details. If anybody listening in had got any additional information on Arrington High and his work in Mississippi, crusading against and trying to help black prostitutes who are being taken advantage of by these white racist politicians, definitely share. You can put it on the Facebook page or email me, put it on my Twitter, what have you. I would definitely like more info about that. We will go ahead to the second audio clip, unless anybody had anything else they wanted to get in really quick. Anybody? Right on. We'll assume folks are good. We'll do the second audio clip. If you had something that you wanted to share, just take a note, jot it down. We should have ample time during the second portion of the audio clip. The person that was dialing in from the block number, again, you can drop me an email and let me know. I'm not sure how you are attempting to call into the program, but we'll see if we can get that figured out so we can get your line opened up so you can share whatever thoughts or comments that you had. My email is untiljustice@gmail.com. You can let me know if you're having difficulties, trouble, and we'll see if we can get you connected as well. We'll go ahead and get to the second audio segment. Again, this is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2.
New York, 1957. George Swanson Starling. George Starling was running the rails up and down the East Coast, and as he did, he was, in a way, running from Inez. George loved Inez, but Inez was not an easy woman to love. There was a storm inside her that nobody seemed able to calm. It had started long before, when she and her toddler sister were left orphaned right after Inez was born. They were raised by poor, put-upon, Bible-thumping Pentecostal aunts who couldn't afford 2 more mouths to feed, and by a Victorian grandmother who thought the only way to break a girl as stubborn as Inez was to beat her the way the overseers beat their foreparents. They hauled Inez and her older sister to their holiness church, where the aunts and the grandmother caught the spirit and talked in tongues. Inez's sister did not let it get to her. Inez rebelled from the start. George had taken a liking to Inez back in Eustis, maybe because she was as headstrong as he was, and knew what it was like to feel tossed about as a child by the people charged with caring for her. He hadn't given much thought to the consequences of marrying her, hadn't given much thought to marriage at all. But now he found himself bound to her with a young son she adored, and as principled and stubborn as he wasn't going to admit defeat no matter how blue and ornery she could be. There were happy times, when the folks from back home paraded up from Florida. George could regale them with stories from the railroad, and Inez could show off how well they had made out in New York, how much better things were there than down south, how the little country orphan girl was living in a brownstone in the biggest, brightest city in maybe the whole world. In the summer, it seemed as if there was someone from Eustis coming up every weekend. If George wasn't on the rails, he would throw some ribs on the grill. Babe Bly, who lived upstairs from George and Inez in the second-floor apartment, would drive out to the woods, out to Westchester or Connecticut, and bring back some possum, or run to the corner store and get the whiskey and chitlins. Inez and Babe's wife Hallie Q would cook up the possum and the chitlins and stir up some collard greens, make the potato salad, and there would be a Florida reunion in the middle of Harlem. Everybody who came up to New York from Eustis knew to stop by George and Inez's place. Soon after so many years with just the 3 of them, their household expanded further. They had a little girl in 1954. She looked just like George and had his temperament. They named her Sonia. Now they had 2 little ones to raise. Then one day in 1957, word arrived about a death in the family that would bring more changes to the household. Inez's sister had taken ill and died back in Florida. She left behind a teenage daughter named Pat, who was bright but distraught, and who everyone feared was headed for trouble. Like many people who had come up from the South, George and Inez sent for the girl to come live with them. Inez wasn't especially happy about her niece coming. Life was hard enough in New York. Inez had put Eustace behind her and was working hard to take care of her own children. She and George had to leave the children alone more than they wanted to, as it was, in order to meet the house note and the property taxes, the utilities, and everything else that seemed to be high just because this was New York. But George saw something in the girl, a quick mind and a good heart, and thought they could help her. Besides, he knew that most migrant families that moved up north took in a relative or two at some point or other. It was how a lot of newcomers got situated in the New World, and was the right and Southern thing to do. There were people in Eustis who never left and never wanted to leave, and couldn't see why anybody would go up north with all the crime and drugs and devilment. They felt sorry for the sheltered teenager whose mother had taken ill and died in her arms, and who now was being shipped up north to live with an aunt and uncle she barely knew in a city she had never seen. "All the people in my little town saw doom for me," Pat said years later. Uncle George took me in. George knew firsthand how the folks in Eustis could be. He told Pat she needed to make the most of the mind God had given her, and warned her that there would be people pitying her and expecting her to fail. "You must not fail," George told Pat, "because they're expecting you to." But when Pat arrived, George was hardly ever around, working the rails as he was. Inez couldn't hide her resentment, and it was just the two of them, aunt and niece, in the first floor of their brownstone sometimes. Inez told her she would give her a week, and then Pat would have to start paying rent. Pat protested that her mother had just died, that she didn't have a job yet. She didn't know the city well enough. Inez didn't need to be told how rough life could be. She had never had the chance even to know her mother. She had little sympathy and didn't want her around. Inez got worried about the money it was costing to have Pat there, and would lock the kitchen to control who could get in. Pat would have to sneak in there when the kitchen was open. "I would go in there and snatch everything I could out of there," Pat said. One day, soon after she arrived, George and Inez left for work, and Gerard, now 12, and little Sonia, who was about 6, were left alone in the house with Pat, who was still getting used to all the lights and the noise and the perils of the big city. About 10 boys showed up at the front door. Gerard let them in, and they all headed straight for the kitchen. They had this white stuff, and they were doing something with it, Pat remembered. She had never seen this in Eustis before. The boys were doing drugs, she later learned. It was summer, and each day after George and Inez left, the boys would show up and head for the kitchen. They would come there to roll that stuff and then hit the door, Pat remembered. The temptations of the city had seeped into George and Inez's house when they weren't looking, when they were out trying to make a living to stay in the city that was swallowing up their son. Pat eventually got the nerve to confront Gerard. "I'm gonna tell Inez," she warned him. Gerard knew how much his mother adored him, and dared Pat to say anything. Pat got up the courage to tell Inez. She told her that when she went off to work, Gerard was letting in a bunch of boys, and they were doing dope in the kitchen. Inez grew enraged. "How dare you say that about Gerard?" she told Pat. George wasn't around. He was on the train, and Inez told Pat she wanted her out of the house. "I don't appreciate you talking about my son taking drugs," she said. Pat was between jobs, was just a teenager, and had no money, but she was too proud to argue with her aunt. "Well, if that's what you want me to do," she said. She gathered what few things she had and started walking, not knowing where she was going. She got to a shoeshine stand and asked the man if he knew of anyone with rooms for rent. He took her to the apartment of a sweet old couple. The wife sang with a gospel group, and Pat stayed there until she got on her feet. George got back from the rails, not knowing what had happened to Pat or where she was. He didn't intercede because Pat was Inez's blood relative, not his. It was only some time later that she saw George and told him what had happened. "Pat, I had no idea," George said. "I didn't know where you were. She told me you had just left. I had no idea that she had done that." Inez was her aunt, but it was George she would always be closer to, like a second daughter to him. "The man cared more about me than she did," Pat said. "Had he been there that day, I would have waited and told him. My pride wouldn't let me." Pat's warnings turned out to be prophetic. Gerard would only sink deeper into drugs and watch his friends die from overdoses of heroin. One of them they found dead in an elevator. Gerard would go on to steal televisions and radios and cash from his parents, anything of value that they hadn't locked up or hidden away or could be easily carried out the door. He would bring sadness and heartbreak to Inez, and especially to George, who could rarely even bring himself to talk about his son. He had come all this way from Florida, and here was something that had turned out worse in ways he couldn't have thought possible. Gerard would get himself together for a time, but would never truly get on his feet, and during those moments of victory, his father preached at him. "You owe God," he'd tell Gerard. "You owe it to him to go around and tell your generation the evil of dealing in drugs and how he rescued you." Inez, who had adored and indulged Gerard, retreated into herself and seemed to take the sorrows out on those around her. She had a coat that Pat used to beg her to let her wear. "A little coat that I loved," Pat said. Pat had come up from the country with few clothes of her own, and when it got cold, she wanted to wear one of Inez's coats, that one in particular. Pat was always talking about that coat. "Uncle George knew I liked it," Pat said. "Everybody knew I liked it." One day, after she had moved out, she saw her Uncle George. "Pat, I got some bad news for you." "What is it?" "Your aunt threw that coat you so loved in the garbage can today," he said. "I begged her not to, but she did it anyway." Pat went to their house and looked in the trash can for it. "By the time I went there, it was gone," Pat said. It all came back to Pat, the things the family used to say about Inez, that they could never make sense of, how when she was a little baby, how stubborn she was and how their grandmother would whip them and she refused to bow. Pat would eventually make peace with her aunt. She would grow up, get married, have a family of her own, and join a church, which was what all of them had been raised to do. Inez never joined a church in New York. It reminded her too much of the hard life she'd had in Eustis, and of a little girl's imaginings of how different life might have been if her mother had lived, the mother who died bringing Inez into the world. Pat managed to convince Inez to go with her on occasion, and every time Pat remembered, she would break down crying, and she'd have to leave the church. Los Angeles, May 1962. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. The song hit the Billboard charts in May 1962. It stayed there for 7 weeks and peaked at number 20. The song was by a famous migrant from Albany, Georgia, Robert's most high-maintenance patient, Ray Charles. It was about Robert, or rather an idealized version of him, in a smoke and drug-filled world of airless recording studios, martini nightclubs, cross-country road tours, and shimmying wig and rouge-wearing backup singer love triangles that was the life of Ray Charles in the 60s, and which Robert entered unavoidably, and not unhappily, as his personal physician during the peak of both men's careers. The song was called Hide Nor Hair, and the chorus went like this. Well, I called my Dr. Foster, and when the girl answered the phone, I got a funny feeling, the way she said Dr. Foster had gone. She said he left with a lady patient,
about 24 hours ago. I added 2 and 2, and here's what I got. I'll never see that girl no more. I ain't seen hide nor hair of my baby since she went away. If Dr. Foster has got her, then I know I'm through, because he's got medicine and money, too. I ain't seen hide nor hair of my baby since that day. Robert knew Ray was working on a song about him, or about a doctor, at least. Ray asked Robert's permission to use his name before recording it. Coming as it did just months after Robert had put his hand back together and delivered his son, it was Ray's way of thanking a man he had come to depend on. Robert, always craving approval and enamored of show business, gave him the go-ahead. Robert wasn't looking to be the subject of a song, and really didn't need it. Years later, he didn't talk about it much, and the times he did, it was rather like a footnote. But when it first hit the airwaves back in 1962, his practice took off like never before. He could see the effects of the migration in his waiting room. Former sharecroppers from East Texas, school teachers from Baton Rouge, gamblers from Arkansas, Creoles from New Orleans. He ended up with more patients than he could handle, more than was really fair to him or to the patients, seeing as how he liked to spend so much time with each one, get to know them and their lives and desires, and seeing how much they took to that kind of attention. He had more business than he ever could have imagined back when he was dreaming of getting out of Louisiana, trying to convince himself, as much as everybody else, that he really could make it in California. It reached the point where the hallway outside his office began to look like some of the train stations during the migration. Patients started lining up hours before he got there. A reunion of Texans and Louisianans and migrants from Arkansas spilling out of the reception room and into the outer corridor. Patients sitting cross-legged on the floor, heads tilted back against the wall, all waiting to hear their names called. They knew he might still be at the racetrack, or just in from Vegas. He'd step over the dangling legs and watch out for their feet as he waded through the crowd to get to his office door. Some would end up waiting all day to see him, and somehow he made each one feel as if he or she were the only patient in the world. He would stay until 10 or 11 at night, or until he had seen the very last patient. It got so crowded, like a Saturday night rent party, that some people just couldn't take the waiting anymore, no matter how good he was. Retha Gray Simon, his mentor Dr. Beck's granddaughter, had a brief falling out with him over the fact that she practically had to block out a whole day to see him. "I knew he was sometimes in surgery," she said, "but sometimes he was at the track. The waiting room was like the neighborhood barber shop." That was just how he wanted it. Gambling and medicine were basically his life. He could lose himself in both, and had a hard time walling off his professional and personal lives. He doted on his patients, and sometimes went gambling with them. He didn't look down his speculum at the cooks and mailmen he treated, and made sure to invite them to the parties he gave. Some wouldn't come for whatever reason, he said. The house was practically a mansion, and Robert threw out the red carpet, literally. Most of them probably didn't feel comfortable, but I was gracious as I could be if they came. I'd bend over backwards to make them come. The prodigals. My father, along with thousands of other Negroes, came north after 1919, and I was part of that generation which had never seen the landscape of what Negroes sometimes call the old country. James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. Besides, they can't run us all out. That land's got more of our blood in it than theirs. Not all us supposed to leave. Some of us got to stay, so y'all have a place to come back to. A sharecropper who stayed in North Carolina, from Merida Golden, Long Distance Life. Somewhere near Cartersville, Georgia, summer 1956. The road signs were warning that the 1956 Pontiac with the shark-tooth grille and chrome racing stripes on the hood was drawing closer to the hill town of Rome, Georgia. My mother was driving, only it was clear from everything about her that she wouldn't become my mother for a while, She would have been wearing a poodle skirt with a cinched waist, a scarf folded Marilyn Monroe style atop her head and knotted breezily at the neck, pressed curls peeking out from the sides. Dark movie star sunglasses dwarfed her face and shielded her eyes, the eyes scanning for the one thing she needed, could not put off, had to do before pulling into her old hometown of Rome. The car was brand new, blue, the color of the flag, as my mother would remember it, with white wall tires and white side panel trim. But it was dusty from the drive, its windshield spotted and speckled, and not looking anywhere close to the $4,000 she'd paid for it. Her sister Teresa, who had followed her up north, was with her, and they couldn't roll into town like that. No migrant could. None would dare let on that their new life was anything less than perfect. They had to prove that their decision to go north was the superior and right thing to do, that they were living the dream, and everything was out of a Technicolor movie set. Besides, the people back home would be disappointed if they didn't put on a show, and so they did. So she would have to find a car wash before she could get so close to town that some neighbor might see her in a dusty old automobile and conclude that things weren't nearly as swell up north as they had been claiming. If she did not find a car wash, it would be all over North Rome before she turned onto Gibbon Street to greet her mother and nieces, who at that very moment were praying she was running late because they weren't finished waxing the floors and shining the windows with old pages of the Rome News-Tribune, hadn't smoothed out the chenille blankets with the cotton ball fringe in the guest bedroom. The cornbread hadn't risen yet. The African violets needed watering. And what if she pulled up just now? My mother delayed her arrival and the moment she would see her own beloved mother to stop in Cartersville to get the Pontiac washed and polished. That was the most important thing, after all. She had driven to Rome before, but it was in a Chevrolet, a used one at that. She had not long before started a new job teaching school, bought herself a row house in an all-white block in northwest Washington, and now had this new car. But it wouldn't mean as much unless the people back home could see the manifestation of all this for themselves. We wanted to arrive in the daytime so people would come out looking at us. My mother remembered of the trip she made with her sister. We tooted the horn and Mother came out. I don't know why we went to Rome. To show off the car, I guess. The car with its precious Washington, D.C. license plates would cause a commotion like a UFO from another planet, which is just what she wanted. And all the little children would look at that shiny, chrome-plated car and inspect the tags and ask, "What is a District of Columbia?" At holidays and in summer, the migrants came home. They would leave a trail of Cadillac dust on Highway 61 in the Delta or along Route 1 through the Carolinas and Georgia. They had prepared all year for this moment of glory, and there were times when in some church parking lots in Grenada or Greenville there were more Illinois license plates than those from Mississippi. They had gone off to a new world, but were still tied to the other. Over time, the language of geographic origin began to change. The ancestral home no longer the distant Africa of unknown forebears, but the more immediate south of uncles and grandparents, where the culture they carried inside them was pure and familiar. The homesick migrants loaded up their sleepy children in the dark hours of the morning for the long drive to the mother country, when there was a death in the family, or a loved one needed tending, or just to show off how well they were making out up north. When they saw the cold airs of the New World seeping into their northern-bred children, they sent them south for the summer, so the children would know where they came from. The migrants warned their children to be on their best behavior, especially when it came to the white people they might encounter. But the children did not have the internalized deference of their southern cousins. They got into scrapes with the other children and couldn't remember all the rules. One migrant son, Emmett Till, on a visit from Chicago to Mississippi in 1955, was killed for breaking protocol in some way that will probably never be known for sure, except that everyone agreed it involved something he had said to a white woman, which only served to remind those who left of the rightness of their decision, and those who stayed how foolhardy it could be to forget for a moment where you were when you crossed into the very different country of the South. Ida Mae did not go back often, not because she was afraid, but because she had a family to tend to in Chicago. She went back for illnesses and funerals, when her mother, Miss Theeney, took ill and died, and years later when her baby sister Talma got sick and died. Her husband, George, went back only once, for the funeral of the brother who had raised him, Willie, and even then he did not stay the night. He left for Chicago right away. Robert Foster did not go back often either. His goal was to get as many of his loved ones from Monroe to move out to California, and he went back only when he had to. Alice had no interest in going, and he did not insist on Alice or the girls visiting Monroe. They would grow up knowing little of their father's small-town Louisiana roots. When he returned home, he put on a show, as would have been expected of him, and made sure it was clear that he was now more California than Louisiana. It would be a long time before George Starling would feel safe returning to Eustis, Florida, seeing how he had left. Southern sheriffs and planters were known to have long memories, and even to go after migrants who had fled north. Some white Southerners tried to convince the workers who had fled that conditions had improved. Some extradited people, for whatever reason they saw fit. Even in the North, refugees were not always safe, wrote Arna Bontemps and Jack Conroy in the 1945 book Any Place But Here. One hard-working migrant was astonished when a detective from Atlanta approached him and informed him that he was wanted back home for spitting on the sidewalk. So George was not inclined to linger in the vicinity of Eustis, Florida. His job on the railroad took him south, but on a line that usually veered west toward Birmingham. The times he worked a train that happened to take him through Florida, he did not leave the station or request permission to go home. The few relatives he trusted drove 30 or 40 miles from Eustis to Alachua to meet him at the Wildwood station, bearing gossip, good wishes, and hams. George, in his porter's cap and uniform, leaned out of the coach door to see them, and left weighed down with homemade cakes or fresh fish they'd caught for him to take back up north. Where they stopped the train and fuel up, they had to stop there a good little while. George's Uncle Andrew, Jack Johnson, said, "We'd go there and meet him, and most of the time we carry him something. Give him his hand out, such as we had." It was a measure of their pride and devotion that the uncle and his wife drove close to 2 hours in thunderstorms and waited for however long it took the train to get there for the few minutes they'd get to see him. He'd have time enough to speak and pass a few words, the uncle remembered, while the train was fueling up. One time, George was hauling luggage at the train stop at Wildwood when up stepped the most feared man in all of Lake County, and one of the most notorious sheriffs in the South, Willis V. McCall. The sheriff was just one more reason that George went no closer to his hometown of Eustis than the depot at Wildwood. McCall was the lawman who had shot 2 handcuffed prisoners, killing one as he transported them from one jail to another for an upcoming trial in the Groveland rape case back in 1949. The trial and the subsequent shootings attracted nationwide attention, partly because one of the men McCall thought he had killed had actually survived to tell what happened to him. The NAACP Field Secretary Harry T. Moore and his wife had died from a bomb placed under Moore's bed after Moore had accused McCall of police brutality in the case. Over the years, McCall would be accused, implicated, or indicted in dozens of cases of prisoners dying under suspicious circumstances while in his custody. He patrolled the colored section in his 10-gallon hat, interrogating and pistol-whipping colored men for any suspicion, and putting colored fruit pickers in jail if he caught them not working on a Saturday. The colored people of Eustis and the rest of Lake County lived in fear of his patrol car crawling through their gravel streets. "Here come the big hat man," the people would say when they saw him approaching. People scurried from the street. They cleared the benches on McDonald Avenue and fled behind the storefronts when they saw him coming. That bench would be cleared in 2 seconds, George said. The sheriff had free rein and used to come into Big George's corner store and drink his sodas without paying. "Well, see you, George," McCall would tell Big George, slurping on a soda to which he had helped himself. The day Lil George saw Sheriff McCall, George was loading baggage on a train heading north. The sheriff was there to get an escaped prisoner from one of the rail cars. The sheriff saw George on the station platform and recognized him from George's father's convenience store. "Hey, don't I know you?" "I guess you do." "What's your name?" "My name is George Starling, Jr." "Oh, you George's boy, huh?" "I'm George's son." That was the only time in all the years that Willis McCall was sheriff that George actually spoke with him. George felt safe because he was about to jump up on the train, and so he spoke his mind as he never would have in Eustis. "I was biggity then," George said, and he got a little red in the face, and he kind of grinned a little bit. McCall regained his composure. "Well, when you comin' home?" "I ain't," George told him. "I live in New York. I ain't coming back to Eustis." George turned away and hopped up on the train. "I ain't not long as you still livin'," he said under his breath. Emmett Till was perhaps the most memorialized black northerner ever to go south, if only because he never made it back alive, and because of the brutal reasons that he didn't. His mother had sent her only child south for the summer in 1955 to spend time with his great-uncle in Mississippi. She never saw him alive again. He was bludgeoned and shot to death a month after his 14th birthday. 3 days later, 2 fishermen found his body in the Tallahatchie River. Against the advice of those around her, his mother, Mamie Till, decided to hold the funeral with an open casket so people could see what Mississippi had done to him. Mourners and the curious clogged 40th and State Streets to line up and see his swollen, disfigured body inside the old barrel-vaulted Robert's Temple Church of God. Many of the people paying their respects had come from Mississippi, like Emmett Till's family, had lived and escaped the violence, and here it was being brought back to Chicago in the form of a 14-year-old boy. It could just as easily have been one of their children lying there lifeless. How many of them had sent their children south to be with their cousins and grandparents, giving them the same warnings Mamie Till had given her son, that they mind themselves around white people. Ida Mae went to Robert's Temple Church of God that day in early September and stood in line with the thousands of others waiting to see him. She felt she had to. It took hours to reach the casket. She was unprepared for what confronted her when she leaned over the glass-covered coffin. The undertakers had done what they could, but an eye was out of its socket, and the face so disfigured that it did not resemble a human being's. She had to look away. George said he didn't want to go, and he didn't. He had lived it, and seen enough. Disillusionment. Let's not fool ourselves. We are far from the promised land, both north and south. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It was a hoax, if you ask me. They're packed tight into the buildings and can't do anything. Not even dream of going north the way I do when it gets rough. A colored man who never left Alabama, quoted in the New York Times in 1967. Chicago, 1951. Ida Mae Gladney. By mid-century, the receiving cities of the Great Migration strained under the weight of millions of black Southerners trying to situate themselves as tens of thousands more alighted from Pontiacs and railroad platforms each week. In the spring of 1951, a colored bus driver and former Army captain named Harvey Clark and his wife Janetta faced an impossible living situation. It was a dilemma confronting Ida Mae and her family and just about every colored household up from the South. There was not enough housing to contain them, and the white neighborhoods bordering the Black Belt were barricading themselves further not flinching at the use of violence to keep the walls in place. Ida Mae and her family moved from flat to flat within those walls. Once they lived in an apartment over a funeral home, where little Eleanor played among the caskets and rode with the undertaker to pick up bodies. As it was, Chicago was trying to discourage the migration of any more colored people from the South. In 1950, city aldermen and housing officials proposed restricting 13,000 new public housing units to people who had lived in Chicago for 2 years. The rule would presumably affect colored migrants and foreign immigrants alike, but it was the colored people who were having the most trouble finding housing and most likely to seek out such an alternative. And it was they who were seen as needing to be controlled, as they had only to catch a train rather than cross an ocean to get there. Nothing had worked before at keeping the migrants out once the migration began, and this new plan wouldn't either. But it was a sign of the hostility facing people like Harvey Clark and Ida Mae, as white homeowners stepped up pressure on the city to protect their neighborhoods. They don't want the Negro who has just moved out of rural Dixie as their neighbor, a city official told the Chicago Defender in a story that described what it called a 2-year city ban on migrants. With close to 500,000 colored people overflowing the Black Belt by 1950, racial walls that had been successfully defended for a generation, in the words of the historian Alan Speer, were facing imminent collapse, but not without a fight. Chicago found itself in the midst of chronic urban guerrilla warfare that rivaled the city's violent spasms at the start of the migration, when one racially motivated bombing or arson occurred every 20 days, according to the historian Arnold Hirsch. Harvey Clark was from Mississippi like Ida Mae and brought his family to Chicago in 1949 after serving in World War II. Now that they were in the big city, the couple and their 2 children were crammed into half of a 2-room apartment. A family of 5 lived in the other half. Harvey Clark was paying $56 a month for the privilege, up to 50% more than tenants in white neighborhoods paid for the same amount of space. One-room tenement life did not fit them at all. The husband and wife were college-educated, well-mannered, and looked like movie stars. The father had saved up for a piano for his 8-year-old daughter with the ringlets down her back, but had no place to put it. He had high aspirations for their 6-year-old son, who was bright and whose dimples could have landed him in cereal commercials. The Clarks felt they had to get out. By May of 1951, they finally found the perfect apartment. It had 5 rooms, was clean and modern, was closer to the bus terminal, and cost only $60 a month. That came to $4 a month more for 5 times more space. It was just a block over the Chicago line at 6139 West 19th Street in the working-class suburb of Cicero. The Clarks couldn't believe their good fortune. Cicero was an all-white town on the southwest border of Chicago. It was known as the place Al Capone went to elude Chicago authorities back during Prohibition. The town was filled with first- and second-generation immigrants, Czechs, Slavs, Poles, Italians. Some had fled fascism and Stalinism, not unlike blacks fleeing oppression in the South, and were still getting established in the New World. They lived in frame cottages and worked the factories and slaughterhouses. They were miles from the Black Belt, isolated from it, and bent on keeping their town as it was. That the Clarks turned there at all was an indication of how closed the options were for colored families looking for clean, spacious housing they could afford. The Clarks set the move-in date for the 3rd week of June. The moving truck arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon. White protesters met them as the couple tried to unload the truck. "Get out of Cicero," the protesters told them, "and don't come back." As the Clarks started to enter the building, the police stopped them at the door. The police took sides with the protesters and would not let the Clarks nor their furniture in. "You should know better," the chief of police told them. "Get going, get out of here fast. There will be no moving in that building." The Clarks, along with their rental agent, Charles Edwards, fled the scene. "Don't come back in town," the chief reportedly told Edwards, "or you'll get a bullet through you." The Clarks did not let that deter them, but sued and won the right to occupy the apartment. They tried to move in again on July 11th, 1951. This time, 100 Cicero housewives and grandmothers in swing coats and Mamie Eisenhower hats showed up to heckle them. The couple managed to get their furniture in, but as the day wore on, the crowds grew larger and more agitated. A man from a white supremacy group called the White Circle League handed out flyers that said, "Keep Cicero white." The Clarks fled. A mob stormed the apartment and threw the family's furniture out of a third-floor window as the crowds cheered below. The neighbors burned the couple's marriage license and the children's baby pictures. They overturned the refrigerator and tore the stove and plumbing fixtures out of the wall. They tore up the carpet. They shattered the mirrors. They bashed in the toilet bowl. They ripped out the radiators. They smashed the piano Clark had worked overtime to buy for his daughter. And when they were done, they set the whole pile of the family's belongings, now strewn on the ground below, on fire. In an hour, the mob destroyed what had taken 9 years to acquire, wrote the historian Stephen Grant Meyer of what happened that night. The next day, a full-out riot was underway. The mob grew to 4,000 by early evening, as teenagers got out of school, husbands returned home from work, and all of them joined the housewives who had kept a day-long vigil in protest of the Clarks' arrival.
Context of White Supremacy. That is yet another cliffhanger. We will tune in next week to see how the riot concludes. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We should have about 35 minutes, maybe a little more than that, before the end of the program. So if you have thoughts you would like to share before we wrap things up, feel free to dial in. Just do not wait until the last minute if you would like to participate. The person that dialed in, last 4 digits, 5772. It is not allowing me, same issue, not allowing me to add you to the line. We'll see if we can get around that, try it out, see if this works here.
Hello?
All right. This is Context of White Supremacy Live. I was just trying to see if we could figure out the problem with the lines. You did call in. You had a hand up to dial into the program?
Yes. I just have a question. I had a question. I just wanted to know, would it be possible to have Millie Fuller come on as a guest to speak about for 3 to 4 hours?
To speak about what?
Of the context of white supremacy.
Did you have a specific, I thought you said a subject, or is it just you wanted him on? Did you have something specifically you wanted him to talk about?
Oh, I really wanted to talk about 2 major topics. One of the major topics is emotions, and the second major topic it would be the mindset of a person who practices white supremacy. I believe he does a good job illustrating the mindset of a white supremacist, and I think that's really helpful. And I do think that understanding emotions and logic and understanding to have a balance of them both would be really constructive. And I think he does a good job conveying that. So I don't know what can I do to help assist in any investing affairs to help facilitate good action.
Oh, okay. I will ask. That shouldn't be too difficult. I will ask, and I'll make sure I remember those topics if we can get him back on. And then, I guess for those specific topics, if I forget or if he doesn't touch on it in the way that you want, just dial in and ask. I'm sure he would be glad to expound, give you his views on those two subjects. Right on. Yeah, I don't think that would be too difficult. I will ask and see if we can make that happen. I know someone else had asked to see if we could get him back for September, and I just neglected to get my request in on time, but we'll see if we can get that done for October. Right on. Folks who have questions related to the text, thank you for the request, sir. Folks who have questions related to the text, Warmth of Other Suns. As I said, we should have about a little more than 30 minutes left in the program. Feel free. Just don't wait until the last minute. If you have any thoughts, comments you would like to share. We should have Mr. Demery 4, B. Moore, caller at 5772. If you all have any thoughts on the text, your lines should be open.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, at the end of the last segment, we covered Harry Box Brown. He was the fellow who shipped himself to the north inside of a box, and the box was 3 foot by 2.5 foot, and Brown was 5'6". And I found it in the text later. I was just wondering how long he had to stay inside that box, because it was impossible for him to eat or to drink any water. So he could not use the bathroom, and he would have to hold himself for the entire time. So I think I found that he was in there for 20 odd hours, so pretty close to 24 hours. He could not use the bathroom, and his joints was probably getting pretty stiff, and it was just a horrendous experience. And then we can't forget about why. I heard that story before, but no emphasis was put on, why Harry Box Brown had to go to those lengths just to get away from the racism and the terrorism that he was experiencing. George and Inez, because of a death in the family, had to take in a teenager, Pat, which Inez resented. And it looked like, because of no fault of her own, young Pat had to endure some hardships. When she snitched on George and Inez's son, Gerard, it backfired on her. And I don't think Inez handled that situation correctly. She acted childish, and I don't even, how to comment on that. Threw the girl's clothes away and all that. It's ridiculous. But Ray Charles included Dr. Foster in a song, which, whether it was that particular incident or not, Dr. Foster's business took off. And I just put down, you have to be careful what you ask for, and be ready. It seems like that, he received his notoriety and his fame, like he had always imagined. But having your office similar to a railroad station is probably not exactly what he had in mind, but he sounded like a guy that really cared about his patient, and he wanted time enough to be able to spend with his patient, which, brings to mind that nowadays doctors can only spend about 15 minutes with each patient, and they barely put their hands on you. So I guess that was the beginning of the new healthcare crisis. In the prodigals, it was important that the migrants would go back home to show off new cars, clothes, and whatever else, to put on the image as if everything was just peachy cream in the north. I made note of the book, Any Place But Here, Bo Temps and Conroy, mentioning a detective coming back from Atlanta informing a hard-working black man in the north that he was wanted for spitting on the sidewalk, which is absurd. They mentioned the racist Willis McCall again. His name comes up, implicating him in Harry T. Moore's murder, along with the vicious murder of 2 handcuffed prisoners that were in his possession. And fear is a vital aspect of the system of white supremacy. Ida Mae went to Emmett Till's funeral, which normally would have been a closed casket because of the way that the racists had disfigured 14-year-old boy. But Emmett Till's mother wanted the world to see what the white racists had done to her son. And we're just getting into the Clarks, well-educated, attractive couple. The mob is wrecking their home and attempting to run them out of town. And the mob includes housewives and grandmothers, which we don't want to exclude racist women from all these terroristic acts. I'll mute my line.
Amen. 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 Grandmothers. B. Moore, do you have any thoughts? Might be just listening in. Line should be open. If you anything sticks out, feel free to chime in as well. Yeah, I thought that was pretty depressing. The portion that was shared about George and Inez, their child, being the difficulty with drugs. I think I'd heard Isabel Wilkerson in one of the interviews where she was talking about that, how some of the families that moved to the north, things did not end happily, where it was just different problems and everything that comes with being in the big northern cities. Yeah, that was kind of sad. I said this book is kind of depressing. Many of the anecdotes that they're talking about, to have that weaved in with yet another riot scene in the north, where a black family is being terrorized. That's where we ended at this week. Last week we ended with a black female being terrorized by a racist man, just trying to make a few extra dollars to support her family. Pretty depressing. Again, and I can understand that fear and depression. I had a listener who wrote in to describe some of the racism she's experiencing at school. And she was talking about just that, how it's kind of depressing, even going over and discussing some of these incidents. It's like you're reliving all the terrorism. And I think that would certainly, just given what these folks have shared, all of our main characters anyway, Dr. Robert Pershing Foster and George Starling, Inez, Ida Mae Gladney, and George. It seems like a lot of depressing things to have to recount what happened to Joe Lee and not being able to get a hotel room, Dr. Foster, and being teased on the job and tackled on the job and all this other stuff. I can definitely see why this, would qualify as something that you just would not want to talk about. Going to the funeral of Emmett Till and what that was like. Just a lot of painful memories, which is what I'm sure pretty much any victim of racism, non-white person in the universe, they're going to have a lot of painful, traumatic episodes that, are just going to be difficult, that would encourage that sort of self-medicating escapism, whether it's using drugs, alcohol, lying to ourselves, just to not have to confront and deal with the trauma and terrorism and fear of racism, white supremacy. But that's our assignment. Pretending that it's not there or ignoring it is not going to solve the problem. In most instances, if not all, it just makes it much, much worse. Also wanted to point out as well, some of the listeners, I was saying before we went to the second audio clip, if you find any information, Arrington High in Mississippi and the work that he was doing, black journalist, if you found any information to share, one tidbit that I did find, this is on Dr. T.R.M. Howard. He was helpful in helping Mr. High escape. There is a biography written on him, Black Maverick, T.R.M. Howard's Fight for Civil Rights and Economic Power. This was published in 2009. Should be available. See it on Amazon, a few other sites. If anybody finds it, let us know. Seems like there are 5 reviews and it got 5 stars, so it seems like it should have some good information. And it looks like they go into quite a bit of detail about Arrington High and Dr. Howard's involvement with, helping him to escape and what he was doing with his journalism. But that's one source. And also the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. This was racist white supremacist organization in Mississippi that went on for some years, and they got tax money. They were taking tax dollars. A lot of black taxpayers in the state of Mississippi, has been for quite some time. This was just private white citizens who were getting money to organize Voltron and work against black people who were trying to counter racism, white supremacy. They have archives, to go back to Mr. Demery Ford's point, they have archives that are available online for records that they were keeping on Mr. Arrington High, even after he moved and he was doing his work in Chicago. After he did his escape in the coffin to get out of the asylum, he continued to publish and do his journalism against racism, white supremacy, and it seems like they were continuing to keep tabs on him down in Mississippi. Dedication. One of the articles that they have online, he was continuing his crusade against Area 8 white lesbians' secrets, and he has a long list. These are different white organizations that are promoting so-called lesbianism, anti-sexual behavior, but this is in the 60s. He has one of them here, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, November 2nd, 1967. Harrison County has 383 members in the State Lesbian Association, white. He has another one here. Let's see. This is Clarksdale, Mississippi, November 2nd, 1967. This does not have a unit of the White Lesbian Association, but the city has 48 members, which is called the Clarksdale Lesbians for White Supremacy. And he has other cities in the state of Mississippi that seem to be conjoined or seem to be promoting both ideals of lesbianism and racism, white supremacy. Very interesting. He has quite a few articles that are on the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission's site of the paper that he was publishing once he relocated to Chicago. Seems like they have at least 10 or 12 issues of the paper that were published in the 1960s. You can check that out online. I would just say again, white people, they devote a great deal of time and energy to studying their victims' subjects. But it seems like this guy was quite a soldier of continuing his crusade, even after going through all of that, having to be smuggled out of an asylum in a coffin, and he is still on the grind, cranking out articles and researching what they're doing down in Mississippi. It is amazing. Arrington High, I'd never even heard of him before the audio clip this week. Anybody else have any other thoughts they wanted to get in? Other people that dialed in, person that dialed in from a block number, your line should be open, and I think this is our caller in Alabama, your line should be open as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, I just wanted you to repeat something you said. I was doing the paperwork, and it kind of flew over my head when you said it, but it was something about a white supremacist group who was doing like counterintelligence, I guess trying to knock off the counter-racist group in Mississippi that was funded by taxpayers. What is that group called again?
The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, and there are a lot of books written on them. If you check online, they have like documentaries, biographies written on this organization. I think I saw a segment on C-SPAN or Book TV about the Mississippi Sovereignty. Like, they're infamous because these were just white citizens. They were not a part of the police or anything else. These were just regular old white people who had enough power that they organized Voltron. They organized. They got tax dollars to fund their effort, and they just snooped. So they would pay attention.
How would you spell the middle word? Mississippi some commission. I can't really make out what the middle word you were saying. Sovereignty.
Yes, sir. Sovereignty is SOVEREIGNTY. And like I said, they are infamous to my knowledge. There are books written on them. This is the one that I think I saw on Book TV. It's the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, Civil Rights and States' Rights. And this came out in 2007. There's another one that is Reconstituting Whiteness, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission by Jenny Irons. And they should have quite a few. Like I said, this group is infamous. They have another one, Spies of Mississippi, the true story of the spy network that tried to destroy the civil rights movement. This is a newer one. This came out in 2010. Let's see. Yeah, they got a lot. Dixie's Dirty Secret, the true story of how the government, the media, and the mob conspired to combat integration. It's a lot. As much as you want to learn on them, it's been lots written on them. Yeah, it's even more than that. I'm just reading. That's just the first 5 or 6 that I'm seeing on Amazon. And like I said, I think they did at least one segment on Book TV about that first book that I read, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, Civil Rights and States' Rights by Yoshiro Katagiri. I think this is a non-white male who wrote the book. I think I saw this on Book TV or C-SPAN where he was given more details. They have a lot of records. Like you're in the South. So if you're in the South, if you ever spend any time in Mississippi and you go to a major state college, Ole Miss or Mississippi State, I'm sure they will have all kinds of records because they kept files and all this. And I think a lot of that stuff got archived. So you can get detailed information about the stuff that they were doing. But they would if you were a black person and you were a member of the NAACP, they would spy on you. They would go to your employer and try and get you fired. They would go to the white people at the bank. Some of them worked, they had positions at high power positions, either at banks or other places where they could impact your ability to get a job, your ability to get a loan. that sort of thing, just to make life miserable for you. If you were a black person in Mississippi and you were trying to work against racism, white supremacy, they definitely had like a file, a dossier on you.
Was it different than the White Citizens Council? What was like the White Citizens Council? What was that?
I think that it's probably a lot of overlap. I could be incorrect, but I think this was a specific title given to the one organization. I think the White Citizens Council, I think that might have just been the refined name for like the Klan, but I'm sure you had a lot of overlap. I'm sure they had the same objective, continued domination over these niggers. I'm sure it was probably a lot of overlap if it was not, in fact, the same organization.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to look into that. I'll try to read up a little bit. I'm pretty sure they got a lot of information on the net and all that type of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it. I'll leave my line.
Mm-hmm. Other person that dialed in with the hand up, your line should be open as well.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, greetings. Yeah, you said it, man. It's a sad listening to it, but it's very informative also. I think observation, really like knowing your environment, and the lack of knowing your environment can get you in a lot of trouble. It seems like that's happening like over and over again. So I'm noticing that as like a pattern. I think maybe some of the reasons why people don't want to talk about the elders don't want to talk about it is because I think part of it is like, admitting to just being, naive or, having a lack of understanding, what I'm saying, like that they were in the war and whatnot. So I think that has a lot to do with it too. Like they feel embarrassed in some ways, because just certain things like with the niece coming to letting he let him. I don't know. I'm just trying to I'm thinking more on situations. It's like you let someone come stay with you, right? And you're busy, but and that your wife has been abused. You know what I'm saying? But so you have this vulnerable person, and you leave him with this person that's been abused, and people seem to know like she took it out on other people. She didn't really cry out a lot. She didn't bow her head, and she was getting beat and stuff. But she took it out on other people. That's like her way of self-medicating. They're like, man, I'm just gonna dish out this abuse. It's the only way she really knew to express her feelings and express herself. So it's like, but you don't think about that. You're thinking you're focused on going to work and this and that, but you want to help this person, so you let them in your house. But like, not thinking that about the whole, the whole scenario. Like this person is she would, the youngster stand with a hateful, like a abused person or whatever. So same thing with the son. Like you don't know their environment. You don't know that the drugs is going to get him. As just a lack of understanding and knowing your environment. And what I think for me, myself, is, but I've already been doing it, but like one thing I, just teach, to anyone I can is like you really have to know your environment, know the terrain, know what the, know what's being sold around town, know, so maybe they didn't have that. I don't know if I'm pretty sure they could have got, the lay of the land if they were interested in. I mean, if they had that. See, that's something that you have to be taught. You have to be taught how to think and how to reason and how to use your logic and really how to make sure that just putting you need as much information as possible. You know what I'm saying? You want to not only survive, but you don't want to be having unintended outcomes You know what I'm saying? Like, if you intend on your niece to be kicked out, or if you intend on your son to become a drug addict, or, you know, things like that, then that's one thing. But if that's not what you intended on happening, then some steps were not taken and whatnot in the process. If your intended outcome was something totally opposite and hurtful and whatnot. So I hope people can learn something from that, because I think we still do that today. We just let our youngsters and really ourselves, man, that the ignorance and the just naivete, or whatever you want to call it. I don't even know if it's naivete, but like just the not understanding what being human means, and trying to get your information and as much as you can, knowing that you absolutely need that information if you're going to successfully navigate or do, you know, whatever your mission is as a soldier. So that's something that I keep. Well, it's something that I've learned, and I'm listening to it, because it's like it's happening over and over and over again. So, I mean, I hope we can put a stop to that somehow, like at least a dent in it.
It seems like that was the goal of Isabel Wilkerson in putting this massive text together. Well over 500 pages. It's 19 audio discs. It seems like that's what she was attempting to do. Black people, even though I think, you know, or I know, white people love this book. White people have talked about it. There's tons of interviews that she's done online. And if you look at the crowd for most of these talks, it's white people that she's talking to. Even with that, I think her hope was to get this information out for black people. I think just the way that it sounds and some of the details that she goes into about Arrington High and some of these other folks, Dr. Moore, am I getting the name correct, down in Florida? I'm a victim. I've been retarded. But just getting out some of that information, I think that's for black people. On her knowing that a lot of black people don't know this history. A lot of black people, not just the migration, because she includes so much history about that. Harry T. Moore, I did have it correct. Dr. Harry T. Moore down in Florida, and his wife, Henrietta. But I think she knows that a lot of black people don't have this information. So just trying to get that out so that we can be better informed and knowing what happened. Even I've heard her. I played some of the audio clips where she was talking about Trayvon Martin down in Florida, Jordan Davis as well, Marissa Alexander, and saying, hey, there's a long history in the state of Florida of them doing this, terrorizing black people. Dr. Harry T. Moore. So I think this whole book was her contribution to saying, hey, we are woefully uninformed about this here system of racism, white supremacy, even though she doesn't use, in my opinion, the most accurate terms, even though there is quite a bit of minimizing and making space for good white people that can be trusted. I think she has a lot of information that can just give you a better grasp of what it means to be white and what the system of racism, white supremacy is, has been, will be for the eternity until we solve this problem. But I think that's what this book was trying to do.
You know, when we were talking about the commission on race relations, closer to what 404 was talking about, when they asked the migrants questions, one was, what were your first impressions of Chicago? And one black person said, when I got here and got off the streetcar, I saw colored people sitting by white people all over the car. I just held my breath, for I thought any minute they would start something. Then I saw nobody noticed it, and I just thought this was a real nice place for colored people. Now, he just came from a place where they were lynching blacks. Now, when he comes to Chicago, just because he sees blacks and whites sitting together, he thinks, he's got the impression that this is going to be a real good place for blacks. You know, it's some type of fantasy world that we're living in. that we seem to think that just because we're in a white neighborhood, or that we have some so-called white friends, or that we interact with them in some type of way, that it's going to be better for us, when everything is, all evidence shows that it's completely opposite. So that's a perplexing question. And you know what? I don't know if it's good to spend much time thinking about that, because we're victims of a system, and the system is constantly reinforcing stereotypes that would lead you into that conclusion. So I don't know if it's any way to deprogram a mass or a collective of non-white or black people.
I hope so. I mean, I don't know about the mass, but I don't even see people really understanding like what you said, and I'm glad you used the word conclusion. Black people jump to conclusions, man. Like they'll observe something and then just extrapolate so far. You know, nobody in their right mind. You know, I mean, it's impossible. You can't do it. Just not, you know, with one bit of information. And then they just jump to a conclusion. Oh, white people and black people are sitting together. This is going to be the bomb. No, that's wrong. Why? Because you jumped to a conclusion. You just took one, you know, you've just taken one piece of data, one bit of evidence, and now you're going to base that on, you know what I'm saying, like kind of like something huge like your life and livelihood and how is it going to, you know, how your life is going to play out. And man, very deep. I hear some of the strangest conclusions black people make, and they just be like, oh yeah, this is what I think this, I think that, and it's like there's no, I mean, you know, it's on very little evidence, very little. So I mean, the problem is going to persist. We're going to have to figure out some type of way of talking about this, because black people say crazy. I mean, you know, we've been trained to just jump to conclusions, man. And some of the stuff that we've concluded just be based off of something you've seen on TV. Yeah, I think that this, that, and the other, and it's just like don't make any sense at all. Like nobody that would with any thinking skills, you would be embarrassed to really express that. But it gets expressed constantly all the time by people, professionals. I mean, degreed, everything. So there's something missing as far as the basics on thinking that we do not have, and we're gonna have to figure out a way of explaining that, even within, you know, people that seem to know, you know, a thing or two. But yeah. You know, another thing I know, it's another pattern and that people could find interesting. I'm sure they have seen that in their own life. Like when Ray Charles hurt his hand, that was based upon him having this tour that he's been dreaming about and things like that. I've seen that pattern a lot, man, where people, it even happened to me recently, you know what I'm saying? Like things was, you know, picking up, whatever, and I hurt myself, you know, training or whatever. Now, I mean, I was gone for months and months and months, no injuries, no nothing, no soreness, no nothing. All of a sudden, I hurt myself in 3 places. And it was like, you know, I had to stop and really, you know, take some type of inventory on, like, what the heck is going on? And I was moving way too fast. I wasn't concentrating on what I was doing. I'm thinking ahead and this and that. But one thing I have noticed is that black people seem to, when something good, when something is supposed to be what you want is about to drop, black people end up hurting themselves. It might not be physically, but something crazy will happen. Will happen, and that could, you know, in that venture or whatever. And a lot of times it does, unfortunately. You know, like Ray Charles was lucky, but I've seen that pattern over and over again. You fall in love, you get into a car accident, you're all hurt or whatever. You get a promotion. Next thing you know, you do something crazy. Drop the baby or something. I mean, it's just you get some crazy ticket or. I mean, what do you think? I was like, that is. Have you observed that also?
I have to ponder on that one.
Man, I've seen it 1,000 times, and I'll tell you, I ain't got the, I ain't been, around that long. I see it all the time. I see it all the time. Maybe I'm not explaining it right, but man, it's just crazy. I see it. I've seen it all my life.
I do remember, I think it was about a year ago, Pam was on the program, and we were talking about how, I think she was just saying it's a tendency, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but she was saying it seems like a tendency to self-sabotage if black people are looking to do something they've been looking forward to, or whatever, something good that's supposed to happen, and then it gets there, and there seems to be some anxiety or apprehension about being successful or it working out, and they'll do things to self-sabotage so that it'll fall through, even though some of the things that you mentioned doesn't seem like they were trying to do these things, but it happens nonetheless. I have to take some time to ponder on that to see if that pattern is true. I'm trying to reflect back on myself and or other people, other black people specifically, and how they've things that they're looking forward to, things that meant something to them, that they were planning for, that were important, and if something happened en route to that where they got hurt, either self-sabotage or just some random act happened leading up to that messed it all up for them. I'll have to ponder. I'll ponder on that and share my thoughts. I also had a thought, too, when you were asking, I think this was like 2 weeks ago, about the lying, and you were saying that white people lie and then black people. I think the major difference, I know you were asking, is that the other side of the coin, or I don't remember the exact phrasing, but I think the major difference with regards to that lying is that we lie to ourselves. White people do not lie to themselves. They lie to other white people. They lie to their victims all day long. White people do not lie to themselves. We, black people, non-white people, victims of racism, we lie to ourselves all day long. And that is, that's the only flaw you need. You can be phenomenal in all other aspects. You can have no other errors. You can be exemplary with regards to all your other skills. When you get to the point where you are lying to yourself, that's the only flaw you need that will sink the whole ship immediately in most instances. I've heard Mr. Fuller say it all the time. That's going to totally stop the show. And I'd say that's a major difference that I see between us and white people. You cannot be a master deceiver and lie to yourself. Black people, we lie to ourselves all day long about how powerful we are, how great we are. White people don't have any control over me. I'm not afraid of white. Just lie after lie after lie to ourselves. And I would say that's one major problem that we need to all work on, not lying to ourselves. We did our 3. I did want to get this in, and if anybody has a final sentence, we can wrap up. If anybody wants to do the prayer, we can get that in as well. But y'all were talking about that quote from the survey where the black person, I guess, said something to the effect of they got to Chicago and saw white people and black people sitting together and thought, oh my gosh, this is Wonderland. This is heaven. This is the greatest thing in the history of the universe. And it reminded me of Malcolm X's speech where he says, that's what we've been told. Hey, that's the end of racism. You can sit next to a white person on the toilet. You can go in and have a sandwich next to a white person, and nothing could be further from the truth. I think we've been programmed, conditioned to think that is progress, that is justice for a long, long time. And obviously it is not. But interestingly, like I said, you can download the book where she got these questions and answers from. It's The Negro in Chicago. You can download the whole book. It's almost 1,000 pages. White people study us in detail. But the response, I told you, she just skimmed the surface. She didn't put all the questions or all the responses in. The response that was immediately before that one in the book. So the question was, what were your first impressions of Chicago? The response that was immediately before that one that she didn't include in the book was, I thought it was some great place, but I found out it wasn't. Uncle told me he was living on Portland Avenue. that it was some great avenue. Found nothing but a mud hole. I sure wished I was back home. That was the immediate response before the one about, oh my gosh, white people and black people sitting together, this is wonderful. So all of the responses are not good. They're all not bad. You get some of both if you get the book, but you can download the whole thing and check out the survey and some of the other responses that people gave. Anybody have any final sentence they want to get in before we conclude?
Yeah, that reminded me of, I was watching this Western with my pops, and Danny Glover was in it. So he's sitting around a campfire with these white people, right? So he's sitting there, and he says, I've been to Chicago. And so one of the white people say, you been to Chicago? You been to Chicago? Like, he was all excited, right? And he said, was it wonderful? And Danny Glover looked at him, he was like, no. It was in the movie. He looked at him and he was like, no. It wasn't, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, that was, I remembered that part in that movie. But I thought that was interesting.
One last sentence. In the Chicago Defender, Dan Burley, I guess it looks like he wrote an article, Mississippi escapee yearns to return, and it was on Arrington High. So the article looks as though he's yearning to return. I don't know. I guess I could check it out online, but that's in the back of the book as a note.
I will definitely check that out. If you have the EPUB, some of these articles are linked, so you can just click on them, like stuff that's online that she referenced. You can just click it. So if that's online, I'll check the footnotes and see if that is available. To the caller in Alabama and some of the other people who were interested in the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, and I tend to think, now that I've had some time to ruminate on it, that is separate from the White Citizens Council, because I hear that name specifically, and that's such a unique name that I would think that would have to be like a separate branch of the white terrorist army. Like I'm sure they just had two different organizations, like the White Citizens Council and then the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, because I just can't see anybody purposely having that long title if there was not a specific separate organization that had that name and whatever they were doing to further white interests. But I posted one of the videos on my Facebook page. This is Rick Bowers, a white man, and he wrote the book. It's Spies of Mississippi, the true story of the spy network that tried to destroy the civil rights movement. It's on C-SPAN from January 11, 2011. It's about an hour and a half. I put it on my Facebook page. The description reads, Rick Bowers talks about his book. The book is about the extensive domestic intelligence network used by the state of Mississippi's Sovereignty Commission in its efforts to stop integration and the civil rights movement. He also showed a video clip of his documentary film being made by Trilogy Films, Secret History of Spies of the Civil Rights Movement. You can check it out. As I said, it's about 90 minutes long. Just once again, I don't think it can be said enough. White people are not ignorant. They have archives. This is white people. I'm sure it's white people in their 20s and teens. This is their parents and grandparents who were doing this. And they have extensive files on what their parents and grandparents were doing. Archival footage, documents, the whole nine. White people are not ignorant at all. They have and continue to do extensive research on how they are dominating us for the purpose of doing so for eternity. Anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I can do it.
Right on. Thanks all for tuning in. Closing in on the conclusion of the book. Should only have maybe 3 more to go, but we are getting close. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. We will be back tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, the compensatory call-in. Tune in, workplace racism definitely a topic that we need to spend more time on. Thanks all for tuning in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. Mr. Demery 4, take it away.
Creator, we come to you as your sons and daughters, asking in the spirit of the ancestors, if you would empower us to have more self-respect, that we will stop lying to ourselves, that we will learn what basic respect is and apply it to our lives, and that we learn to get to know ourselves and know what our standards and our principles are, and that we will be able to stand for something so that we won't fall for anything. Ashe.
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 Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.